here to show the destruction of a temple in a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Son Jong-in reports.
We have a very contentious issue for you today. Our motion is send them back. The Parthenon marbles should be returned to Athens.
Now, English Heritage has asked members of the public to help stop a rise in illegal metal detecting.
So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining us from in the world, and a very warm welcome to Rescue and our 2022 conference on the protection of heritage in time of conflict. We are extremely grateful to the 100+ people who registered for this event, and we hope to see as many people here as possible, especially as they are all keen to engage in this vital and timely topic. So, I would like to start off by briefly introducing Rescue, the British Archaeological Trust, for those here who may be unfamiliar with us. Rescue is a group that has been campaigning and fighting for the protection and recognition of archaeology for some 50 years. Over these years, we've had successes, most notably being instrumental in getting archaeology formally recognised in planning-led development in the UK, which has directly led to the creation of thousands of jobs and the protection of hundreds of thousands of archaeological sites. However, the issues and concerns facing archaeology and heritage now are as prominent as they ever were, if not more so, as well as the traditional challenges of professional recognition, heritage provision, employment, etc. We're now facing new 21st century challenges such as climate change, intangible cultural heritage, mental health, workforce diversity. And so the work of Rescue remains vital and we can only do this with your support, and we can only continue that fight with your support. So moving on to the conference itself. Whilst heritage affected by conflict is nothing new, we look back at, let's say, Carthage in 150 BC and various other battles. I didn't think that in 2022, we would be having a conference stimulated by a war in Europe. As a result, Rescue felt that it was a timely moment to discuss not only this conflict, but the wider and sadly ongoing issues of heritage and conflict globally. However, it is important to add that conflict legacies stretch far beyond traditional war, and we continue to be spurred by challenges such as climate change, historical geopolitical tensions, repatriation, ownership, and continued marginalization of communities, many of which are touched upon in the talks today. To that end, we are extremely privileged to have brought together for you today an outstanding selection of heritage professionals from across the globe to discuss this truly international heritage concern. Before we begin, I would just like to set out the structure for today's conference and some of the basic house rules for those unfamiliar with Zoom. The conference is divided into 2 sessions of approximately an hour and a half each, with a short interval in the middle. The sessions will be chaired by my colleague, Dr. Sophie Viron. Session 1 will focus on the immediacy of sites and conflict, while session 2 will look at the long-term aftermath of conflict on heritage and associated criminality. At the end of each session, there will be an opportunity to receive questions from the audience. In terms of some of the basic Zoom house rules, I would be extremely grateful if everyone could mute their Zooms during presentation to allow the speakers to have the floor. Presenters we are under a particularly tight schedule, and so I will provide you with an audio ping for a 5-minute warning before the end of your talk. Throughout the presentations, you may wish to post questions on the Zoom chat, the audience, or which Sophie will monitor, or you can raise your Zoom hand during the Q&A session at the end of each of the the two sessions we have. The entire conference is being recorded, which we will edit and make available through the Rescue website in due course. Finally, you will notice some of our speakers have included their Twitter handles, so please feel free to promote them and this conference through the Rescue hashtag Conflict Heritage. I would like to pass on my thanks to my colleague Sophie Vienneron for co-organising this conference and for direction forward for the production of our conference programme. The dreadful and shocking events occurring in Ukraine, Syria, and other countries across the world are felt by the entire heritage community, and I'm sure I speak for everyone here in providing sympathy and solidarity with victims of conflict. Closer to home, it has been a difficult period for the United Kingdom with the passing of Queen Elizabeth II, which, as a result, we have lost some of our original speakers. I therefore would be extremely grateful if you would like to join me in a moment of silent reflection on these moments. Thank you very much. Right, without any further delay, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker for today. We are extremely honoured to have with us Professor Peter Stone, the UNESCO Chair in Cultural Property Protection and Peace, and President of Blue Shield. For the past 20 years, Peter has dedicated his work to the protection of cultural property in armed conflict. His contribution in this field led directly to the establishment of the Cultural Protection Unit in the UK Armed Forces. Peter has published widely over the past 30 years, particularly on subjects including heritage management, interpretation, and education. He was previously head of the School of Arts and Cultures, Professor of Heritage Studies in the International Centre of Culture and Heritage Studies at Newcastle University. Before joining Newcastle, he had worked at English Heritage as a field archaeologist and history teacher, and between 1998 and 2008, he was Honorary Chief Executive Officer of the World Archaeological Congress. In 2011, Peter was awarded an OBE for services to heritage education. On behalf of Rescue, I would very much like to thank you, Peter, for being with us today. Peter, you have the floor.
So what I'm going to be talking about today is, as on the slide, protecting heritage and armed conflict, predominantly the work of the Blue Shield, but I'd like to contextualize that in a slightly broader introduction. Are you on? Yeah. So I want to take us back to the end of the Second World War, and effectively what was seen by the international community as the failure of the League of Nations set up at the end of the First World War to prevent international conflict. And obviously by 1945, that had been seen not to be overly successful. So the League of Nations was and I'm being very simplistic, predominantly political and economic organization. With the creation of the UN, the international community created an organization that was based not only in politics and economics, but also in humanity and in the creation of the UN's cultural, education and scientific organization, UNESCO. That became explicit that peace, the objective of the League of Nations, but also of the UN, must be established on the basis of humanity's moral and intellectual solidarity, more so or just as much as the economic and political aspects. So that was the first major step. Second major step, just the actual prosecution and conviction of a number of those Nazis who were prosecuted, convicted at Nuremberg trials for crimes against cultural property for the first time ever. The 48 Universal Declaration of Human Rights has the access to culture and cultural property established in there. And then possibly the most interesting one from our perspective, the early drafts of the 1948 Genocide Convention had two forms of genocide identified in it. Firstly, barbarism, and then secondly, vandalism. Barbarism, genocide against people; vandalism, genocide against their cultural heritage. And the drafters of that, and in particular Raphael Lemkin, who did the first drafts, saw the indisputable, indivisibly link between those two aspects. You can't protect people without protecting their heritage. You can't protect their heritage without protecting people. Unfortunately, the chapter on vandalism was taken out of the convention at the last moment at the insistence of the so-called settler governments, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, with the support of a number of ex-colonial powers, including the UK, where because they thought they might be criticised under the convention for their treatment of indigenous communities in their lands. So while it was there, it was taken out at the last moment. But then, of course, the 1954 Hague Convention, and I'm not going to go in any detail on this because others are coming later to talk about the legal aspects. But it's interesting to flag that the drafters of the 54 Convention envisaged and they referred to it as a blue and white shield organization to be the Red Cross for cultural property, the cultural equivalent of the International Committee of the Red Cross. That didn't happen, and it didn't happen for many years, but that was the intent. Now, actually, none of this was new, because for the last 2,500 years, since Sun Shao writing in 6th century BCE China, military theorists and strategists have all argued that the destruction of cultural property in armed conflict, and especially the destruction done by troops under your command, is a bad thing. And the simple reason for that, summarizing a couple of millennia of thinking, is that it almost always leads to the next conflict. So don't do it. From Sun Shao to Polybus to Hugo Grotius von Clausewitz. And one of the first times it was codified in national law, the gentleman in the middle there, Francis Lieber, who had fought in the Prussian military at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, but then moved to the USA and drafted General Order 100 for federal troops in the American Civil War, which protected cultural property. But even before then, there were earlier political and military manifestations of this. The earliest one that I've found so far is, interestingly, given current interpretation of Islam, a patent by Muhammad in his lifetime, granted to the Holy Monastery of Sinai and protecting the monastery and all associated buildings and churches and sacred areas. And then the first time I've got it in a legal military document, the so-called 1385 Durham Ordinances. And these were the rules and regulations that the English army, just about to invade Scotland, had to abide by. And the penalty for damage to cultural property, which was essentially referred or relating to religious property, was death. So taken seriously all that time ago. However, not taken as seriously in recent times. So the failure to plan for the invasions of of Afghanistan in 2001 and then Iraq in 2002-3 was a major contributory factor to the damage and looting done in those countries. The image on the left shows you the looting of the National Museum, one of the storerooms there in 2003 in Iraq. But more important, and when we're trying to make a case for protection of cultural property, the destruction of the Al-Aqshiri Mosque on the right there in 2006 led to a change in events in Iraq. So by 2006, the Iraqi population were increasingly fed up with the continuing presence of coalition troops on Iraqi streets. But the destruction of the mosque in 2006 caused those coalition troops to have to stay for a further 5 years, because what happened was it turned the disgruntlement into the full-scale sectarian civil war. And those extra 5 years took 5 years worth of casualties for the coalition, 5 years worth of fatalities. But while those two are appalling themselves, probably worse, 5 years of losing the media campaign. And the media campaign was lost at that point by the coalition, which gave the opportunity for the re-emergence of Al-Qaeda in Iraq and provided the oxygen for the creation of the so-called Islamic State. Now, I'm not saying that the only reason for those was the failure to protect cultural property, but it was a contributory factor and a not insignificant one. So, moving forward, the actual creation of the organization of which I'm proud to be president, the Blue Shield, only 42 years late. It is now an international organization under Dutch law dedicated to the protection of heritage for conflict and disasters, and established by four, what we now refer to as the founding four heritage organizations, ICOM, ICOMOS, IFLA, and ICA, museums, monuments and sites, libraries, and archives. We now have 30 national committees globally, and the founding four and the national committees together elect an international board, and the secretariat, paid for at the moment through my UNESCO chair at Newcastle University, together comprise Blue Shield International. And we're named after the emblem of the 54 Convention. Our mission is that we are committed to the protection of the world's cultural property, and that we're concerned with the protection of cultural and natural heritage. That's seen too much as a Western concept, that division. Many other countries in the world don't understand that distinction. Tangible and intangible in the event of armed conflict, but because the training and the need to understand the importance of cultural property is 70–80% of the same for armed conflict or following a natural or human-made disaster, we have added those last two to our work. And there you see the National Committee for Argentina at the end of filming a 6-part or 6-episode series on cultural property protection for Argentinian TV. Our end goal is the creation of healthy, peaceful, stable, sustainable communities, because with those, there is much less chance of conflict breaking out. Our primary context is the 1954 Hague Convention and its protocols, but underpinned by the wider international law and UNESCO and the UN strategic agendas, in particular from the UN's point of view, Security Council resolutions, and from there in particular 2347. But we're also conscious of the Sustainable Development Goals and for things such as the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. We see CPP as a multi-sector responsibility and opportunity. And that was just one of my colleagues in that slide there, working with NATO on a training exercise. To do that, we can't do it alone. And to protect heritage during conflict, it cannot be left up to the heritage sector. We have to work in peacetime to develop partnerships with what we call the uniform sector. So not only the armed forces, but also police, customs, border organizations, the emergency services, the humanitarian sector, and of course, the heritage sector, many of whom are still uneasy with working with armed forces. We have to understand the political, legal, and media environments in which all of that work takes place. And we are developing formal relationships and partners across the spectrum of those, for example, with the ICRC, with NATO, with the UN peacekeeping deployment in Lebanon, and in process with UNESCO. And there you see training with the Irish Defence Forces, who only deploy as UN peacekeepers back in 2019. So we envisage that as a triangle set within a circle. And as all good self-respecting triangles, this one has 3 points, those 3 sectors: heritage, uniformed, and humanitarian. But as put to me by an American colonel last year, oh, so I get it. The space between those points inside the triangle is the space where there are no stupid questions, where those three sectors, all with completely different starting points, can work together to mitigate damage and destruction of cultural property to their own agendas and for their own exit points, which are all very similar. But as I say in Blue Shield language, the creation or maintenance of those healthy, peaceful, stable, sustainable communities. So that's what goes on in the within the triangle, if you like, the sort of professional side of this work. But outside, we have to understand the political nature of that, because that will change everything that goes on inside the triangle in any particular circumstance. The political situation may be benign, it may not be. We have to understand the legal situation, and we'll hear about that later today. And crucially, as I flagged earlier, we have to understand the media context of all of this. But the reason that we do it all is down there at the bottom, communities, because with those healthy, peaceful, stable, sustainable communities, it is much less likely for conflict to break out. So that's as we envisage the work. A key issue, Blue Shield International is an independent, impartial and neutral organisation. Therefore, we will not and we do not publicly denounce any particular party to an armed conflict. We do not point the finger of blame. What we do is ask all parties to any conflict to abide by their international obligations and responsibilities under international and possibly national law about protection of cultural property. By doing that, we can work behind the scenes with all parties to a conflict. And we do that and are doing that at the moment in a number of conflicts that you can think of, I am sure. Obviously, that behind the scenes work is confidential, but trust me, it is going on. We do hope to fulfill the original 1954 aspiration to become the cultural equivalent of the Red Cross. But I always say it's not going to happen in my lifetime. But if we don't put the foundation blocks in place now, it won't be in my grandchildren's lifetime. There is a caveat to that independence, impartiality, and neutrality, though, because our 30 national committees may find it by their very nature less easy to comply with those three critical elements for Blue Shield International. So as an example, sadly, in late last year, in November, December last year, we were talking to colleagues in Ukraine about the creation of a national committee for the Blue Shield in Ukraine. That discussion got overtaken by events, but we could fully understand from a Blue Shield International perspective that a Ukrainian national committee, had it been formed, may not be able to stick to that independence, impartiality, and neutrality. So we get that, but the top level, BSI, that's where we work from. And we've developed something since 2012 that we refer to as the Blue Shield approach. It's why we do things and how we do things. And it's intended to provide national flexibility within a common framework. And the critical thing that we must all think about is our work must begin in peacetime. Immediately before or during conflict or a disaster is too late. So these are the 7 parts. I'm not going to go through them in detail, but just to pick up very quickly through them. The 5 issues are things like, do you protect people or do you protect heritage? People first, always, but the protection of people and the protection of their cultural property or their heritage, as identified back in the mid-40s, are indivisibly intertwined. Do we call it cultural property or cultural heritage? It doesn't really matter. We tend to refer to it as cultural property because that's the language of the legal documentation, but the two are effectively interchangeable, and others as well. The 2000 Strasbourg Charter gives us our elements of independence, neutrality, and impartiality. Our mission statement you've already seen. We developed something called a 4-tier approach. What are the 4 times that the Blue Shield needs to go into action within the triangle to address cultural property protection? And there are these 4 times. Long term, education, raising awareness. Immediately before a deployment, what is the cultural property in country A? Is it protected? How is it protected? Who's protecting it? All of that information, we need to be able to work with our uniform colleagues and our humanitarian colleagues to get that information across so that they can do their job more effectively and efficiently while protecting cultural property. During conflict, we can provide something that the military refer to as reach back. So they may intercept a carload of antiquities or things that look like antiquities. The driver of the car may say, no, this is all tourist tat and nothing to do with anything that was just being looted from the museum down the road. But what the military can do is send photographs back of that material and get within 24 hours, usually, a clearish response saying, yeah, that looks real, impound it, or no, that really is tourist stuff, let the guy get on with his job. So there's that reach back approach. And then the 4th tier is post-conflict or post-disaster, where the cultural property is almost as much risk in tidying up and sorting things out as it is during the actual conflict. So those 4 times, the 4-tier approach. We've identified 6 areas of activity that we ask BSI and all national committees to plan to and to report on an annual basis. We don't mean the national committees have to do the 6 areas as they are laid out. So coordination, legal processes, training, emergency response, those are 4 of them. But they can pick and choose the priority that they give them regarding their national situation. And they don't actually have to address all 6. Nearly all national committees are entirely voluntary based. And so we understand that they can't do everything every year. So it may be that they only prioritize 1 or 2 areas, but we want them to prioritize, we want them to think about it, and then we want them to report on it. And we do that at Blue Shield international level as well. When I first got involved in this back in 2003, friends said, look, Pete, stop. Cultural property gets damaged in conflict. It's collateral damage. It just gets damaged because people are firing at each other. Yes, it does. And that's a significant threat to cultural property. But we've worked out that there are 7 other major threats to cultural property during a conflict. And if we address those at the planning stage or at the education stage, at the training stage, those threats can be significantly lowered during the conflict stage. So we have those 8 threats, and all of this is on the Blue Shield website. And then finally, 7 reasons why CPP is important for the uniformed and the humanitarian sectors in particular. So, for example, the UN Security Council see cultural property protection as an international security issue. So especially the uniform sector have got to take that very seriously. There are other reasons. A recent study by the International Office for Migrations found that 73% of Rohingya refugees identified their loss of cultural property and their loss of their cultural heritage as one of the primary factors in their poor mental health, a key aspect of humanitarian work. So there are 7 reasons there. Again, I haven't got time to go through them all, but that's what the approach works out. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about some current activity and then how we've done over the next 6-7 minutes. Firstly, we're raising awareness. Events like this, we're building the capacity through a 3-stage set of training with national committees. We're working with a lot of military organizations, but just picking out NATO on a template for cultural property protection information, which we'll come back to in a minute. We're developing exercise input. So NATO have hundreds of exercises each year. And what we try to do with the major exercises is put cultural property problems into those military exercises. So the military have to react to those cultural property problems. We're developing a policy on CPP with NATO, and I'll come back to that quickly at the end. And we're working with other national and multinational groups. We're developing generic training materials and courses for peacekeeping missions. We're working a lot with the humanitarian sector. We're working currently with a number of Eastern European countries who are feeling more vulnerable than they were on the 23rd of February. We're working with the supporting of protection of cultural workers and cultural property in Afghanistan. And we're looking for long-term funding for a central team of 12. So how are we doing? So just picking out a couple of points. In the 2011 NATO-led air campaign against Colonel Gaddafi's troops in Libya, Libya was supposed to, as a state party, produce a list of cultural property that should not be damaged unless military necessity dictates. And I'll leave that to the legal conversation later. Libya couldn't do that. And so the US and the UK national committees essentially did it for them and gave that list to NATO. And a NATO targeteer sitting in an airfield in the Netherlands identified 6 vehicles of a mobile communications unit parked immediately outside and inside a large derelict building as a target for the next day. I don't know the detail of what happened next, but the equivalent of a red light flashed on his or her computer because the coordinates for the derelict building and the 6 vehicles was the same as the coordinates for a Roman building that we had given to NATO. The targeteer had identified one large bomb to be to hit the derelict building and destroy all 6 vehicles, including the derelict, and would destroy the building as well. That was changed by a decision further up the command structure to 6 precision weapons, which destroyed all 6 of the vehicles. And as you can see, one of them in front of this Roman fortified farm, and the other 5 look exactly the same as that, but leaving the farm and the Roman site almost entirely intact, a little bit of shrapnel damage. They got considerable positive media coverage there, which they were completely unused to. They got so much good publicity that they instigated an internal review. And that review, which reported in December 2012, recommended that NATO should develop a cultural property protection policy. We're not there yet, but there was a step in the way with a directive in 2018, and we are starting working this autumn with NATO on developing that policy, which we hope will go to the Joint NATO Committee next year. In Syria in 2017, as the coalition moved to attack ISIS's last bastion, Raqqa, they had to decide how to get into the village, into the town, city, which is surrounded by a 2.5-kilometer medieval wall. The planning took into account the heritage potential of that wall, but they also took into account casualties, potential fatalities, and all of the other normal military aspects. And they decided, having taken into account the protection of the wall, that they would target only 2 25-meter sections and thereby saving the rest of the 2,500 meter wall. And that was good planning, destroying a bit, but not much more. The ICRC, who had refused to get involved with protecting cultural property in 2003, by 2020, the then director would announce protecting cultural property and cultural heritage against the devastating effects of war, unfortunately remains a humanitarian imperative today, perhaps more than ever. I'm running out of time, but very quickly, we had been working in Lebanon with the UN peacekeeping force, the Lebanese armed forces, the DGA, Blue Shield Lebanon, and an NGO called Biladi since 2013. That developed trust and a partnership. After the explosion, we worked with the DGA, and we divided up the work in securing a number of buildings, and that worked very well. But then UNIFIL got permission to move out of their normal area of responsibility to Beirut to help. And UNIFIL then phoned us and said, what can we do to help? We know there must be a lot of damage done to the heritage. And so we worked with UNIFIL and their heavy lifting equipment, with the Lebanese army, and with our own architects to stabilize two buildings that had been badly damaged during the explosion. One of which you see here, which is the home of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And the three sides where there is white roof going on is where the three sides of the building which took the brunt of the explosion. And all of the tiles of those three sides were ripped off. The building in that type of building is stabilized by the weight of the roof. So because three-quarters of the roof had been blown away, the walls of the roof were going out like this at a rate of 20 centimeters a week. So with UNIFIL and LAF's support, we were able to put on a temporary roof, which is supposed to last for 5 years. It may well last for 25 years, while the money is sourced to actually go and do the long-term work to refurbish that building. But with that work, which would only have happened through 7 years of partnership and trust building between the Lebanese armed forces, the UN armed forces, and Blue Shield. I'm not going to go through this as well, but the 2013 article on the four-tier approach led directly to the establishment of the UK military Cultural Property Protection Unit. And the commanding officer of that unit lists here why CPP is important to the military. So yes, there's a legal responsibility. Then underneath that, he lists a whole area, a number of points about how it supports the mission success. But he ends up by saying two things. Regardless of everything above, it's our moral obligation to communities to do this when we're fighting in their countries. And then as a note back to the commanding officer, it's a failure to plan for CPP will lead to problems for us. We've still got a huge way to go. The guys there in the image are volunteers, mainly archaeology and architecture students from Beirut universities, who helped us do the securing and the stabilizing of some of the buildings post the explosion in Beirut. We need more national committees. And as I say, we aren't going to be the cultural equivalent of the Red Cross or the ICRC in my lifetime, but we are beginning to put the foundation stones in place so that we will be pretty soon thereafter. Thank you for listening, and I hope I haven't overstayed my welcome too long. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. That was a really interesting and engaging presentation. You packed an awful lot into a very short space of time, and I think my head is spinning already. But I particularly honed in on the concept of communities lying at the core of what you were discussing, and particularly healthy, sustainable communities. And as a person who works within a different world of planning and development, where the discussion, the debate is all about healthy, sustainable communities, and our heritage plays a role in that. It's very interesting to see the comparisons in the world of conflict and heritage. I had hoped to take some questions now directly for you, but we are running ever so slightly over time. So if it is okay with you, we will put the questions at the end of the first session, where you can pose questions to Peter. So thank you once again, Peter. We're now going to move on to the first session of the conference, which is entitled Sites and Conflict. And I am going to pass over to my colleague, Sophie Veron, who will chair the session and introduce the presenters. Over to you, Sophie. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel, as well, who is really the main organizer of the conference. So I think you've arranged great panel here, great panels. So welcome all, and I am sorry that we actually have to talk about the destruction of cultural property in time of conflicts. It just shows that this issue is very much alive today. So, but to do so today, to this first panel, we actually have a panel of experts, academics, practitioners, representative of the French army as well, and also archaeologists who work in zone of conflicts, Ukraine and Syria. So I would ask all the panelists to please stick with 15 minutes so we could have a little bit of a chance for conversation towards the end. I know we could spend lots of time listening to each of you because you have so many interesting things to say, but please keep your time to the minimum 15 minutes. So our first speaker is Dr. Rebecca Hawkes Reynolds, who has a PhD in archaeology and is also a qualified barrister. She now works for a planning archaeological and heritage consultant at the MOLA, the Museum of London Archaeology. And she researches the various framework of cultural heritage protection at the Institute of Art and Law. So Rebecca, the floor is yours. Thank you.
As Professor Peter Stone very brilliantly just explained to us, the modern international law protecting cultural heritage came out of the catastrophes seen during the Second World War, which saw an enormous amount of looting and destruction of cultural heritage across Europe. Itself, prior to the Second World War, the League of Nations had begun drafting proposals, but these never actually came into effect. So the main body responsible for cultural heritage protection is UNESCO. The way UNESCO has developed its mechanisms for cultural heritage protection are through three different types of works. The first, of course, is a convention, which creates a reciprocal legal obligation between states, which states parties are entitled to have enforced. This requires national legislation to be enacted to put the convention into effect. A recommendation does not create any legal rights compared to a convention. It is, in essence, we could call it a best practice. And then, of course, there is a declaration, which is not legally binding on states, but it can influence, but it does vary depending on the organization sponsoring it. There are no informal enforcement procedures regarding UNESCO conventions, recommendations, or declarations. UNESCO is expected to monitor the enforcement of its conventions and its compliance through reports submitted. So you can possibly begin to see that part of the issues with this is that there's no international law court governing cultural heritage under the UNESCO conventions. It is therefore very difficult to enforce these conventions as well as enforce, adhering to the conventions. The enforceability is down to national law. There's a bit of a problem of states policing other states when it comes to national law. And then, of course, you have the problem that not all countries sign up to the conventions. They may sign up, but they don't actually implement it, which means they don't create the national law within that country or the state party, as the UNESCO terminology is. It may implement some of the conventions, but not all of them. They add variations, which results in variances in interpretation. The conventions themselves are very broadly drafted. The benefit is to allow individual nations a degree of variation to implement them how they see best to do so. But on the other hand, it causes problems and conflicts of interpretation. So the first one, and the one that everybody knows, is of course the Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflict. Now, understandably, this one was drafted, in the wake of the Second World War, and its prime focus was to avoid a repetition of the events that saw during the Second World War with regards to cultural heritage or cultural property at the time, as it was called, bearing in mind there is now a difference between the words cultural property and cultural heritage. Now, this convention, I've put up the main articles, the main points of the convention, which is the duty to safeguard cultural property before and during conflict, not to use it for military purposes, train the military in the principles of the conventions, and of course that as an occupying power, you must safeguard and preserve the cultural property of the country that you have occupied. As an example, as I mentioned, not all countries sign up to these conventions or implement them. The United States became a party to this convention in 2009, the UK in 2017. This convention was followed by its first protocol, which came about in 1956. The protocol sort of ironed out a few sort of inconsistencies and clarified a lot of the points. So where a state property occupies territory during armed conflict, it must prevent the export of cultural property or looting. And this ban is absolute. They cannot decide what can or cannot be exported. It is an absolute ban. But there is no duty to search for objects that have evaded customs. Seizure can take place regardless of how it has been acquired, and the return of objects removed must be done at the close of hostilities. However, close of hostilities, for instance, isn't defined. Does it mean a ceasefire? Does it mean a full end of conflict? It's not very clear. And the cultural property must be returned to the competent authorities of the previously occupied territory. This last clause, for instance, resulted in a few issues in the 1950s. For instance, this Polish coronation sword was removed from Poland 2 days after the invasion of Poland by Germany in 1939, and it eventually ended up in Canada. However, at the end of the Second World War, Canada wasn't very keen on returning it to Poland because by that time, Poland had become communist and was the sort of satellite state to the Soviet Union. And therefore, there was a conflict of political interest and observation. So how do you overcome that sort of difference of, but we don't like the authority that's taken over the country afterwards? The second convention second protocol to the Hague Convention came into force in 2004, and it was dated 1999. Again, this protocol helped iron out and certain inconsistencies and issues as a result of subsequent conflicts that have happened since, primarily the Balkan conflict. So it improved the implementation and the rules of responsibility. It offered an enhanced protection for important cultural property. And however, it's still not adopted by many states. So again, we've got this issue again of, while the intent is there to offer protection to cultural heritage, it is limited by nations willing to adopt it, sign up to it, and then, of course, create their national law to implement it. The Illicit Traffic Convention of 1970 deals with preventing and prohibiting import and export and transfer of ownership of cultural property as deemed illegal by the state that it comes from. So basically, state parties must render illicit in their own national law imports that are illicit exports from another state. This in essence requires some sort of bilateral agreement between countries. So you have to agree that if something is illegal in one country, it is also illegal for this object to arrive in your country. This is done by using export certificates. In terms of sort of markets and selling, it requires dealers to have a full record of where this object has come from to make sure that it hasn't arrived in the current country that it's in illegally. This convention is implemented in many different ways in different countries, which means sometimes it is a little bit tricky to enforce. Imports require countries to have bilateral agreements if they want to basically adhere to this. That does not always happen. For instance, an irony of this particular convention was that in 2001, prior to the Taliban destroying the Bamiyan Buddhas, there was an initiative from several European countries to temporarily remove cultural objects from Afghanistan to a museum in Switzerland. However, it was defeated by this convention because Afghanistan is a signatory and requires export licenses to remove cultural property from within Afghanistan. Unsurprisingly, the Taliban weren't willing to sign these export licenses. So you can see, again, while the intention is there, the problem is it relies almost on the goodwill of the nation of these countries for their cultural heritage objects to be protected, which of course is sometimes, depending on where you are in the world, politically defined. Another example of sort of the failing of this convention was the case of Leonardo Patterson, who was a pre-Columbian dealer who was tried in Germany. Germany had ratified this, or at least the state of Munich had ratified, Bavaria, had ratified this convention into their law. However, their law required that lists of cultural objects be provided in German or English. Obviously, as South American countries, their lists were in Spanish, so it failed at that hurdle. The argument for this was that it was to avoid manipulation of the list. If the German authorities cannot understand the contents of the list, then it is of no use. Similarly, the list must include a detailed description of each object to allow for correct identification. Well, that obviously seems very logical. It's, you can probably imagine, an incredibly labor-intensive task to do so, and is really only possible for museum pieces where the museums will have lists of their objects. It is not possible to do this for archaeological objects that have yet to be discovered, or small objects, within private collections or in churches that will only come to knowledge, unfortunately, once they have been removed from a country illegally. So a lot of the time, the way certain countries implement these conventions bureaucratically almost set them up to fail, one could argue. Another convention...
Rebecca, sorry, you have like 3 minutes left.
Yep, I'm almost done, don't worry.
Good.
Another convention is the Unidroit Convention, which focuses on private sales and dealings between private citizens as opposed to the museum and states. Again, it's limited. It requires bilateral agreements between states, which again makes it complicated. Another convention, which was the intentional destruction of cultural heritage. This one was done in response to the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas by the Taliban. It upholds the existing obligations, and it was trying to encourage states to become party to these instruments protecting cultural heritage. But again, of course, as we've seen in previous examples and in current examples today, a lot of this is politically defined. There are also EU instruments, but of course, EU instruments will only work within and between EU countries, except, of course, sometimes they can be extended. So EU instruments such as the Council Regulation in 2013 and previously in 2003 basically prevented the sale of any objects coming from specific countries of conflict identified at the time, which was Syria and Iraq. So there can be quick action, of course, but it isn't always foolproof. So apologies for this sort of whirlwind tour of international law, but hopefully you can see some of the problems. they require bilateral agreements. It is not up to one country to police or dictate how a country enforces a convention, or whether or not they actually do enforce it. Export licenses, they require bilateral agreements. Now, aside from the sort of legal discussion, there's also the concepts of ownership of cultural heritage. And how does that work? So there we go. That's my very quick, very brief introduction to the legal framework of cultural heritage.
Thank you. I know this is a mammoth task to present really briefly the legal international framework of international cultural heritage law. So thank you very much for this overview. We're now going to have two speakers. So please forgive my pronunciation. Yeah, I can see that you're there. So we have first Dr. Vesvo Ivakin, who is he's a graduate of the Faculty of History of Taras. He also works at the Institute of Archaeology of the National Academy of Science of Ukraine. And we have Dr. Pavlo Shidlovsky, who is also an associate professor and the head of the Department of Archaeological Expedition and a specialist on the prehistoric site of the Middle Dnieper region. So we're very grateful that you both take the time to come and explain to us what is the situation here today in Ukraine and what are the threats and problems of the protection of cultural heritage in a situation of conflict today. So thank you. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Vsevolod Ivakin, he is right here, and Pavlo Shidlovsky, it's me. We will speak about the archaeological heritage and the problems which we faced with directly now during the war which going on. And thank you very much for the possibility to make some presentation on this great conference. I think that our information, it will be quite relevant for the moment. So can I share my screen? Our presentation named Ukrainian Archaeological Heritage Under Threat of Russian Aggression, Problems and Prospects. And we will speak about, here we will speak about mostly about archaeological heritage as everybody understands that military conflicts always cause irreparable damage to nature and culture. And the first target of the invaders, the first target of aggressors is the monuments and sites of cultural heritage. So for the moment in Ukraine, such buildings as libraries, museums, churches, and historical buildings and monuments of monumental art is on the spotlight of the aggressors because they tried to kill not only the people itself, they tried to kill our identity. And it is why in many towns and cities we see even such actions as the firing of the books, firing of libraries. But if we talk about the territory in which damages occurred, it occurs not only on the territories where was occupied by the aggressors, but also the whole territory of Ukraine now is under the bombing, under the missile firing, and that is why all the territory of our country is suffer of such actions of the Russian troops. And significant destruction we see mostly not only on the visible monuments of cultural heritage, but it's a problem with the archaeology because archaeological sites are in unmanifested state and nobody knows how many archaeological objects can be found in a certain territory. And that is why the actions which made for culture protection mostly focused on the visible objects, but archaeological sites left under the focus of the site protection protectionist mostly. And that is why we need to start the monitoring of our archaeological heritage. And firstly, we need to try to made some typology of the destructions which caused such damage to our archaeological landscapes. These destructions is the destructions related to the direct conduct of military operations, which led to landscape transformations. Destructions associated with the arrangement of military objects, because military objects mostly created on the used significant places on the topography, such as burial mounds, hill forts, different ditches and walls, is the places where modern military objects are built. After all what I mentioned, we can say about the destructions associated with the use of archaeological monuments as modern military facilities, and destructions associated with the illegal excavations on the archaeological sites, because we see the acting of the criminal groups from the side of the aggressor. And of course, the looting of the archaeological collections on the local, historical, and lore museums. And of course, the acts of vandalism. So if we just several photos about the example of the destructions, the left picture is a burial mound, which was affected by the missile firing. And on the right is the use of the burial mounds for the modern military objects. Of course, the same, the use of group of burial mounds as the modern military object. And of course, many sites are destroying during the fortification, modern fortification against from both sides, from Russian side and from Ukrainian side. But the partial destruction of archaeological sites caused by the construction of protective structures by the armed forces of Ukraine is a consequence of the need to protect the humans and houses. Because in March, in the first months of war, we need to protect our lives. And that is why there was no question about is there an archaeological site or not? Because of course, the main reason is to protect ourselves. And of course, this is illegal excavations on the occupied territory. Here you can see the burial mound, which was destructed by the illegal excavations. And even the organizing the firing places and different posts on the burial mounds. Here you can see the mark about the burial mound, which was destroyed by the occupiers. And of course, the acts of vandalism. You can see here the territory of Izium Reserve with the statues of Scythians and Middle Ages, and that was destroyed by the invaders, by the occupiers. And of course, the looting of the museums. We have two big museums which was totally destroyed by the occupiers, by the Russian troops. This is Melitopol Museum and Mariupol Museum. And the collections of these big museums was disappeared. You know the situation in Mariupol. In Mariupol we have unique collections of the Stone Age Mariupol Neolithic Cemetery, and this collection, it's a unique collection of anthropology of different goods, and this museum was totally destroyed during the bombing, during the missile firing, and after it was looted by the occupiers, by the soldier troops, Russian troops. And of course, we have some questions about to start the process of monitoring of these destructions, and we face it with a big amount of different problems. First problem is that even before the war, we have the zero level of the archaeological registering on the territory of Ukraine. We have a very bad condition of the different heritage protection institutions, and that is why for the moment we have no even database or digital maps of archaeological sites of Ukraine. Of course, the problems is the assessment for the damaged territories, which need to coordinate the actions between archaeologists and between military forces, military administrations. And of course, one of these problems is the lack of archaeologists itself, because many of the scientists escape into evacuation to different countries, and many archaeologists go to the front line. And of course, the big problem is the slowness and in decision-making and bureaucratization of state bodies. And that is why we have a big problem with starting the governmental programs for documentation of the damaging of archaeological sites. And that is why we can say that to solve these problems, we have the uprising of civic initiatives, non-governmental initiatives. And one of these is the cooperation between different non-governmental organizations to start the process for documenting of the war. Even the first methodological source for current situation, handbook for the armed forces, what they can do when they find archaeological things, was made not by the government, but was made by the non-governmental organization Union of Archaeologists of Ukraine. And that is why contemporary situation needs to require to do some actions to strengthen control over immovable and movable archaeological objects and archaeological heritage. That is why for the purpose of such actions, for the purpose to control and to monitor this archaeological sites, we create such organization or such initiative or such group as Archaeological Landscapes Monitoring Group. For the moment, in the organization of this group is involved the representatives of such official organizations as Ukrainian State Institute for Cultural Heritage, Institute of Archaeology of the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine, Faculty of History of Taras Shevchenko National University of Kyiv, National Museum of the History of Ukraine. As you see, there's different academic, museum, and educative organizations, and together with a non-governmental organization, we create such archaeological landscapes monitoring group. And we trying to start the process, trying to put the damaged territories in a digital map. So the first pilot project was supported with by the German Archaeological Institute, and they propose to mapping the damaged sites on the territory of the Kyiv and Chernihiv regions. These regions is the most suffering the first months of the war. And you can see the using of the satellite photos to understand which territories was damaged by the war. You see that this brown spots on this map is the fired territories fired by the bombing or missile firing. So, and we trying to use distance monitoring different facilities to understand where we can find the archaeological sites. A big problem is that many archaeological sites can be discovered due to the different disasters, natural disasters such as floods or earthquakes. But now we have an anthropogenic disaster. We have a war. And of course, during our future work by the monitoring the archaeological heritage, we will find a huge volume of a new archaeological sites. That is why, of course, we need a big amount of different equipment and facilities, and mostly we need people because as I told you, we have some lack of archaeologists, professionals now here in Ukraine to start this process for monitoring. So that is the main aim of this monitoring is to create a digital map and a database of the damaged landscapes. And of course, now many archaeologists, many our colleagues are defend our land, defend our territory, and of course we're trying to protect not only people, not only buildings, but also our heritage. And as we understand that only educated society will win, of course, because archaeological knowledge as knowledge at all is an effective tool in the struggle against xenophobia, clericalism, and ideas of national exclusivity. And of course, the struggle of Ukrainians for independence is also the struggle for the values, the humanistic values, among which respect for the cultural and natural heritage of humankind is of a particular importance. And thank you very much.
Thank you for your presentation and almost sticking with the time. I think it's just so sad to feel this, to see these pictures of this damage, and it's great to see what you're doing. I think now we're going to have our next speaker. So I'm becoming speechless. We're going to have our next speakers who's going to discuss what has happened in Syria, because I think you mentioned about mapping, you mentioned about inventorying, you mentioned as well the problem with cooperation, which is something we're going to address in the second panel with the issue of looting, because those objects that are actually being stolen and can easily be stolen because of the situation. What happens to the subject and what kind of international cooperation we can also develop in order for these objects that have been looted to be returned to Ukraine or to Syria or to another country. So our next speaker is Adnan. Sorry, once again, I apologize for my pronunciation. Adnan Mahad, I'm sorry, who is an honorary research fellow in the Department of History at Birkbeck at the University of London, who I suppose has also studied in France because he was honored with Charles de Gaulle Université France Prize in 2009. And what he's doing now is documenting the looting and destruction of archaeological sites in northern Syria. So we're going to have the experience of another zone in conflict. And Adnan, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I would like, first of all, to thank the organizers of this meeting for inviting me here today. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this presentation. I'm going to talk about the role of local communities to protecting the antiquities during Syrian war, some evidence from northern west of Syria. This is a map of Syria showing northwest Syria in the blue rectangle. I will focus on the Idlib region in yellow, which is under control of Tahrir Sham or Jabhat al-Nusra, which is listed as a terrorist organization by the USA and many countries. In early 2011, extensive peaceful demonstrations took place in Syria against the Assad regime that by 2012 turned into a full-blown war that caused widespread destruction, resulting in hundreds of thousands of dead and wounded. It had disrupted the economy, destroyed the infrastructure, prevented children from going to school, closed factories, and deterred investment and trade. As a result of the war and violence that has existed since 2011, Syria remains the world's largest displacement crisis. According to the estimates of international organizations, around 6.7 million people in Syria were living in internal displacement at the end of 2021. In northwest Syria, there are 4.1 million people, including 2.7 million internally displaced. As a direct impact of the war, some archaeological sites have become shelters for hundreds of Syrian families who are internally displaced. The use of archaeological sites as displacement camps has caused serious damage to the sites. Before talking about the efforts and initiatives of local communities to protect antiquities in northwest Syria, allow me to show you briefly some of violation against antiquities in this region. As we can see here in videos, actually, the grave damage to Syrian cultural heritage inflicted the war has demonstrated the failure of international organization and cultural agreement to protect antiquities in Syria, and highlighted the divergent attitude of Syrians themselves regarding their heritage. Some Syrians were themselves involved in plundering and actions of destruction, as we can see in these videos, also in these photos. Here in this photos, we can see digging and using metal detectors looking for antiquities. Also, the using of heavy machinery in bulldozing archaeological sites. Breaking stones of ancient buildings. Actually, many of those who have lost their home or been internally displaced are using materials from archaeological sites to build the new homes. This remains a serious threat in Idlib, as entire historical buildings are disappearing as a result. Damage to the Marath al-Nu'man Museum is the largest mosaic museum in Syria. Assad forces targeted the Marath al-Nu'man Museum with barrel bombs. A large part of the museum building was destroyed, but thanks to the protection project, the mosaic were only slightly damaged. This project has protected around 1,600 square feet of mosaic. Damage to the building of the Idlib Museum as a result of the bombing of the Assad forces. In May 2016, the Russian air forces attacked the church of Saint Simon, damaging the remains of the pillar of Saint Simon, as well as the rest of the site. Some archaeological sites have also been used as a military post or training grounds by armed groups, preventing local as well as international organizations from working to protect them. In these photos, we see the use of archaeological sites as training and shooting camps by extremist group. This photo showing the fragmentation of the ancient walls due to the bullets used by the fighters of the jihadi group. Idlib museum warehouses after looting by Jabhat al-Nusra and its allies. Despite all of these violations, many initiatives have emerged to protect antiquities in different regions of Syria. In this section, I'm going to quickly highlight the success stories of local communities during the devastating civil war in Syria. These initiatives are considered a commendable achievement worthy of being highlighted. These are 5 Syrian organizations consisting of Syrian archaeologists from inside and outside of Syria, working to support the initiatives of local communities to protect antiquities. In northwestern Syria during the war, for example, in Idlib and its countryside, local communities have continuously worked on initiatives and to protect a project to safeguard archaeological sites, despite all difficulties and challenges, including aerial bombardment by the regime and Russia, extremist organization like Jabhat al-Nusra, the increasing number of antiquities looters, action of vandalism and destructions, and the lack of resources. Among this initiative, for example, are workshops with local councils and decision makers in the region to protecting antiquities. After the government forces were expelled from Idlib, local civilian councils were formed to manage the region. The civilian entities, including local councils, adopted a neutral, disengaged stance to begin with. But after many workshops with these councils, cooperation and coordination memoranda of understanding were eventually introduced and signed with the local council to allow the documentation and safeguarding of archaeological sites in their respective areas. In the photo, we see example of this workshop to coordinate with the local councils to protect antiquities and on the importance of cultural heritage and the need to protect it. Also, awareness raising campaigns on the importance of antiquities protection among school students have been ongoing since 2014 through field trips or to museum and archaeological sites. Also, awareness raising campaigns among girls and women. Also, connecting children to their heritage through different activities, such as restoration of artifacts, excavation method, and competitions for drawing Syrian archaeological sites. Also project for documenting violation against the archaeological site in Idlib region, damage assessment project. Also project in cooperation with local communities to collect artifacts found by people in the area, where they are documented, preserved, and placed in the museum. Protection of the mosaic of the Ma'arat al-Nu'man. Actually, the Blue Shield helped the local archaeologists and to do this project. This project was carried out by a local team of heritage professionals, which included the museum staffs, archaeologists, and civil society activists from the area. This project protects around, as we said before, 1,600 square feet of mosaic. The Idlib Museum also project, the inventory project showed that the warehouse of the Idlib Museum contained 15,000 artifacts from different periods, 1,500 cuneiform out of the 2,201 recorded cuneiform numbers, and 4,000 miscellaneous artifacts out of the 7,500 artifacts registered in the museum archive were looted. Thank you to this project, around 5,000 artifacts have been protected, and the Idlib Museum has reopened to the public since 2018. The castle of Saint Simon suffered from different types of violations during the years of war in Syria. An emergency intervention to conserve and stabilize the most damaged parts was carried out. We see in the photo support of the ark, with metal presses. This procedure reduced the load pressure on the lateral pillar and contributed to the stability of the facade arch. Briefly, I will talk about factors preventing or enabling community engagement. Whilst there are obstacles and challenges to local culture protection initiatives in all Syria, such as aerial bombardment, economic collapse, displacement, clashes, extremist organization, the increasing number of antiquity looters, action of vandalism and destruction, also the lack of resources, community in Idlib have been able to overcome these or to adapt to them. This have been achieved thanks to a number of factors. The first one is the presence of local archaeologists and other with an interest in antiquities, high local educational and literacy levels, the relative neutrality of military and civil actors in relation to cultural protection activities, financial and technical support from Syrian and international organizations, the flexibility of local community, including a specific contribution of women and children, the formation of governorate-wide authority, facilitating local movement with limited bureaucracy. Finally, the ongoing conflict and security situation inevitably leads to the prioritization of relief and humanitarian work by both organization and individual. The protection of cultural heritage is often set against basic human rights, such as access to water and safety. In addition, organizations with a cultural heritage mandate are reluctant to start antiquity-related activity due ongoing security concerns, as well as international sanctions prohibiting the transfer of funds to area under the control of factions classified as terrorist group. In addition, basic awareness-raising initiatives to educate local community on the importance of their heritage to deter them from looting and excavating sites are under-resourced and often unable to fully realize their aims. The challenges is still in addressing the logistical issues of transferring funds, equipment, and supplies into Syria legally. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for your presentation, which is really showing as well how communities can get together in order to reappropriate their heritage, in order to protect their heritage. So it's about what happens when we have some kind of peace. Our next speaker, so I hope you're keeping all your questions for the end of the session. We still have two speakers. So our next speaker is Capitaine Tim Lebert, who holds a master's degree from the École du Louvre in Art History and Heritage Conservation, as well as a master's degrees from the University of Heidelberg in Military History. He joined the French Army in 2013, and since 2019, he's the Deputy Director of the French Army Heritage Office in Paris. And he's going to present to us the implementation of the cultural property protection in French military operation, which is what Professor Peter Stone talked at the beginning of his presentation, or talked in his presentation, CPP, cultural property protection. So how does the military implement all these rules about the protection of cultural heritage? And also want to thank Captain Lebert, because it's actually the second time that I can welcome him in a webinar, not yet in person, but thank you very much for accepting this invitation. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sophie. I'm really glad to be here with you today for one reason. The first one is that really quite often when we are speaking, the heritage community or the political society is speaking about cultural property destruction or cultural heritage preservation in time of conflict. There is no military, there is no one soldiers in the room. But during conflicts, the military and soldiers are key actors. So we often we don't have to forget to invite them to speak about what's the challenge they will face for this specific case about cultural property protection. So thank you, Sophie and Rescue, to invite me to give a military perspective and also the French military perspective in terms of cultural property protection. As Professor Peter Stone mentioned earlier today, we are not facing cultural property destruction for the first time in the last decade. And also it's not the first time in this century that a military unit or an army is dealing with military property protection. If we are looking back in the history and the French history from my side, we can look that even during World War I, the French army had to set a specific military property protection unit. The question is why? Why do the soldiers need to be involved in military in cultural property protection? The answer is that when you are starting a conflict, civilian society will blow up. You will have a lot of civilians who will flee the combat, and in combat area, the first actor are the military. They have a freedom of movement. They can request for equipment, but when it comes to cultural property protection, they need to be involved if we want to be effective on the field. This is the major task. And when we are looking at during World War I, the French army set 3 platoons in the northern and east France to protect, to preserve, to evacuate collections, to protect building, churches, etc. So they were key actors in cultural property protection because there was no more civilian society able to protect it. So it was the task of the military. It was the same things during World War II. The key success in the protection of French cultural property during World War II was after World War I, we saw that we had a lack of preparation. Preparation, as Professor Peterson mentioned, is key success when we want to be effective in cultural property protection in time of crisis, but in time of war. The French Army General Staff started to set plan in 1936 to look how we should protect monuments, or we should evacuate collections, again in northern and the east part of France. From the beginning of the World War II, as the 1st September 1939, within only 4 months, they protected more than 236 monuments. They evacuated a major part of the collection in northern France. So it was really effective. When we had to protect a stained window from the Cathedral of Strasbourg, it only took 3 days to evacuate all of those windows. They could do it within 3 days because they were prepared to do it. And also the military commanders were they were able to understand that the military would be involved in that protection. So key success is to have military planning, and it's also for us today still really useful to understand how were those military units set, or what was their mission, their organization, because it's always the same story. It was the same story even during the 70s, the 80s, or the 90s. Every time when the military is deployed, everywhere, every time, we are acting in zone where you have cultural heritage, you have monuments, you have archaeological sites, you have museums collection. So everywhere where there was a war, there is cultural property in danger. So military will act in those environment, and it's up to you to the heritage community, I mean, to explain them what they are, how they can deal with that, how can they effectively protect it. So it's what we are doing in France within the French Army General Staff where I'm set. So the French Army is really glad to have a specific branch of military curators. So as we mentioned earlier today, it's quite difficult for the heritage community to speak with the military because there is no clear understanding of what is cultural heritage, what does the protection mean, and we are able to do it with our own mean. Our military curators are full active duty officer within the French Army. They have a cultural heritage background as from the École du Louvre or from the National Curator School in Paris. But they are at the same time, they have a military background. So it's quite easy for them to liaise between the cultural heritage sector when we are speaking with museums director or with curators. It's part of our job. But also when we have to advise our military commanders, we can use their term to explain them that we should be able to protect this building, or to do it, to conduct this training, or to implement the Hague Convention within the French Army. So, which is what we start really to do in a new way some years ago. So we said earlier that preparation and peacetime is key for the success when we want to be effective during wartime. So there is many things we can do at every level to support the protection of cultural heritage. You need to have in mind, and it's something which is quite difficult sometimes for the heritage community to understand, that our purpose during conflict is not to protect the cultural heritage of the mankind. I'm sorry for that, but we can contribute to that. So our purpose is to act under international and national regulation. But it's not an argument that a military commander will easily understand, even if it's mandatory for him to act under international regulation. But also, our task as soldiers, as military, and as cultural property protection officers is to support mission success. This is key to understand and to liaise with our two community. Is from a military perspective, we can protect cultural property to support mission success. This is key. So there is many things we can do. During peacetime, we can prepare where are the cultural heritage on the field. We need a list. So your cultural heritage specialist, you have the list. We don't. It's not our job to know what is the cultural environment. So please share with the military when you know you have a specific list for a country, for a region. So liaise with your military, authorities to say, okay, you can put some site on your no targeting, no strike list. We can advise and support our military commanders to understand that the military will be involved in cultural property protection because you have cultural heritage everywhere. We can train and exercise our troops to raise awareness, but also, and it's key, to collaborate with all sectors. So something we can do first is the military move with orders. If during a conflict we don't get any orders from a political level, or when we are deployed overseas from a national authorities, if we don't get any request to protect cultural heritage, it will not be our first task. So this is key is to get orders. Also, it's mandatory to get specific regulation to make possible to implement, for example, the 1954 Hague Convention. The 1954 Hague Convention, Article 7, provide military measures to set during a peacetime military personnel, specialized personnel to be involved in cultural property protection. So we can have a national regulation, army regulation to explain that we could set a specific unit for that, for example. So it's what the military creator in France do. Then we can raise awareness at every level. We can raise awareness from cadet, from the troop, because everybody will be involved at some point or will act close to cultural heritage. They need to understand that. So it's up to us to raise awareness for them. We can also train specific specialists, legal advisors. Legal advisors, they know the Hague Convention, but then they have to advise military commanders how to do it. It's not only to say that we have international law, but it's how can we implement it to be effective on the field. This is a really critical thing. It's how to do it, to explain how can we be effective. We can train our civil military personnel, for example, to find some project to do it. And we also set specific training for our experts, our army curators. They will be the first people involved in cultural property protection, because, and therefore, it's why it's complicated to implement cultural property protection on a military way is because it's a cross-cutting topic. It's for everybody, every time. We can also set specific CPP training for engineers, for example, because when they will conduct search from bodies, sometimes they can find archaeological artifacts, but it can also we can also train our soldiers during those training on CPP, and also engineers when they will dig trench, like in Ukraine we saw on the prior presentation. Soldiers can find archaeological find. How will they have to react when they find such artifact? Also, we can like Peterson mentioned, we can set some specific cultural property protection incident during military exercise. If we forget it, so we'll never be trained, and military commanding posts will be never trained to react in terms of cultural property protection, to have that in the military thinking process and military order process at every level. Also, we can assist our ministry, every department in terms of cultural property protection. There is many ways to act in cultural property protection. Also, the use of Blue Shield is key to train our soldiers. We put Blue Shield every time we can in it's like urban warfare training center in east of France. So we put some Blue Shield to make awareness that this is a cultural property. This need to be protected. How do you set your military exercise with that cultural property in the middle of it? Also, we use it for personnel as it's provided by the Hague Convention. But also, key success for us when military will be involved in cultural property protection is to use the military capacity and the military capability to do it. If the military have a 3D scanning capacity, for example, or photograph or drones, can we use it to protect or to monitor cultural destruction, cultural property destruction, or cultural property inventories? If we already have the capacity, we should use it for a cultural property protection purpose. So it's our daily job is to, at every level of the military, to say that, is it possible to do something? Also, we can directly support our military commanders on the field, as we do when we are sending curators, army curators on the field to advise our military commanders, but also to liaise with the heritage community and the civilian authorities, as we can conduct specific cultural property protection project, as we did on the white pictures. This is a specific project we did to help the National Central African Republic Museum to be restored after the conflict. So this is something the military can do, and then there is time for everything. There is a time for the military, but when we slowly go to post-conflict, we can slowly got those projects, everything we did, to the civilian society. So there is a time for everybody at every level, from a tactical level on the ground as to a strategic or a political level. It's key to collaborate with all the ministry. It's a cross-stepping topic, as to liaise on an with international bodies, as with the UNESCO, with NATO, with the Council of Europe. There is really supports many projects for the military to be involved in cultural property protection. Also, it's key to liaise with other units. I'm thinking, for example, to the new US Army unit created last August, or with a British cultural property protection unit, with also dealing with that question in England, or also with the Austrian who mostly focus on a national territory level in time of crisis. So perspective for now, for example, when we are looking at the military armed conflict and cultural heritage, is, for example, to help our Ministry of Culture to set plan to safeguard cultural property in event of armed conflict. Key things is to have a plan as no plan at all. So the military have a capacity, have a knowledge, have a long and rich history, which can be really useful for the civilian society to be more efficient and to have better success in case of armed conflict, to preserve and protect cultural property. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it's really interesting to have the perspective of one of the point of the triangle that was mentioned by earlier in the presentation, having part of the uniformed. And as for an academic, it's always also very interesting to know exactly what happens in the field rather than and how those conventions are applied. So we're having a last speaker who is Dr. Guy Yarosbev, who is who teaches managing archaeological sites and digital heritage courses. He's also specializes in cultural heritage management, cultural tourism, sustainable development, and planning. And I think, as we spoke about in the different conventions, the importance of preparation, documentation, and inventorying. Here the speaker is going to talk about monument recording, digitization, and heritage data management. So what can happen and how can this help the situation in Ukraine? So Guy, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope everyone hears me, and I'll try to share my screen. So I'll try to be as quick as possible. Of course, I recognize that we're running a little bit late. When the conflict in Ukraine, Russian invasion started, we started talking to different colleagues, primarily within UCL and Global Heritage Fund at UCL, being myself and the Dr. Marco Nebbia, my close colleague. And we decided to do something about documenting heritage and helping Ukrainian colleagues. And we teamed up with a group of Ukrainian colleagues. I will not be able to mention all of their names here. We received a small emergency grant from ALIF, as many of you know, International Alliance for the Protection of Heritage in Conflict Areas. And we started our work in documenting heritage sites and documenting damage to them. The idea was very much creating this standard baseline database that's truly open and it can be shared with multiple partners. And we had awareness of the security concerns, but also issues in local bureaucracy. So Ukrainian colleagues before me very kindly mentioned some of the issues, organizational issues, and some of the issues with the staffing, for example. We were aware of all of those issues, and we decided to do something very open that can help in the future to them as well. And then the aim was not to compete with everything else that was going on, especially at the beginning of the conference. There were There were a lot of events, conferences, and discussions, and also different international organizations were trying to do different things. But we wanted to create this combination of field assessment led by our Ukrainian colleagues and collecting archaeological data into one geographical information system package led by us at UCL, and merging it together with some in-depth analytical information from specific areas. And we primarily focused in 3 regions: Kiev, Chernihiv, and Kharkiv. And we wanted to create something that has a value as a heritage management tool and a decision-making tool with one eye on the post-conflict recovery and the post-conflict situation where we can potentially support our Ukrainian colleagues. And we did not want to focus on architectural, but naturally we ended up documenting more damage in urban areas where architectural monuments are prevalent. We wanted to also direct our focus to less visible prehistoric monuments as well. Often those were seen at the beginning especially as very important for placemaking, and also we expected them to receive a lot of damage because of the motorized warfare or armored warfare activity around them. So initially we collected all the open access information about the monuments into one GIS package. It looked roughly about like this, but it changed gradually. We added a lot more layers and a lot more details. Here we use some of our knowledge or some of our expertise from other projects elsewhere where we do national and international heritage inventory systems. So we created a more of a detailed description of each monument where we created specific areas, specific fields where data was entered, and then we supplemented this with damage reports. And those reports were primarily coming from Ukrainian colleagues, although we were watching some of the media reporting and also social media reporting as well. We wanted to collect a lot more photographic recording, but it was not possible. Very early on we realized that those challenges with picture taking was going to hamper the progress in this area. Everyone is probably aware of the media reports of Ukrainian government banning or restricting photographing the damage because it was going into social media and helping the invading army, the occupying army, to correct their fire. And then also because of the issues of morale and because of all the issues with the spying and the informing to the enemy. So the picture taking became a very difficult thing for us. We also wanted to use the app developed by GHF called Amal, and we even spent some time translating it into Ukrainian and into Russian. And GHF worked a lot on upgrading the Android version, because the Android was a very highly used operating system as opposed to iOS. Despite that, it was hardly possible to use this app. We are nevertheless using it in some limited areas, despite the restrictions on the picture taking. And then we wanted to collect data into some centralized area, especially with considerations of the challenges that Ukrainian colleagues were facing. Many of them were not having a very reliable internet in early parts of the conflict and still in unoccupied areas. So we created a very simple online Notion table, and Notion is one of those online platforms where everyone could enter data, and then we can easily export it and integrate it into our GIS package from our end as well. And then on top of that, we added the satellite imagery. So initially we had many questions about its usability and the actionability, the famous so what question, even if we notice something on satellite imagery. And so we wanted to focus on more of a long-term analysis instead of focusing on this instant report saying something, we noticed a damage, but instead we wanted to see how that damage was evolving and how the patterns were developing. And here our strength is and was very much the Ukrainian colleagues who focused our attention on specific areas and then also validated or strengthened our findings if we noticed on a satellite imagery as well. So we started collecting some imagery and some data from open access sources, and then the media reports that use satellite imagery, but gradually we were able to establish this collaboration with Planet Labs. Many of you probably saw their satellite imagery in media reporting, and they kindly provided this unprecedented access to 3 specific areas in Ukraine that we were focusing our attention on. And I'll try to show some of the examples. I think one good example here will be Izium. Izium is on the news quite recently, quite a lot, because of its successful liberation, and because of President Zelensky's visit there, and also because of the potential war crimes as we can see now. But I was watching Izium for other reasons, even before its liberation as well, because it's a very strategic point. A lot of change was happening there. So what we did, and also Izium is one of those historic settlements in Ukraine that's registered officially, and it has many monuments with differing levels of significance and the designation. And here I just wanted to show the central area of Izium. As you can see on an OpenStreetMap, I placed those red dots, which are our records in our database. And if we correlate that with the reports of damage that we received from local colleagues, you can see that almost all of the historic monuments or historic properties, their cultural properties, they received some sort of a damage as well. And then most up-to-date news reporting suggests that up to 80% of the buildings in central parts of the city are damaged. If that's true, then it's almost likely that, almost certain that every historic building with a historic significance will require some sort of an attention post-conflict, and they have some damage. So what satellite imagery tells us, because this exercise became both an analytical exercise and also an exercise in explaining to colleagues that what satellite imagery can tell in this situation, and also what it cannot do for us as cultural heritage specialists. So here you see the central part of Izium. This image is taken on March 12th. I select this image because it has a very good snow cover, and I highlighted the 3 areas. And actually, I'm not sure if you see maybe I'll take this one, and then you'll see my laser pointer here. So this is the area where Ukrainian colleagues earlier showed some of the statues, for example, as an example of the vandalism and the damage, that they are located roughly in this area. It's a very high area in Izium, Mount Kiremyan, which is a strategic point with a viewing platform, but also a telecommunication tower, which is here. So very early on we noticed some damage, some artillery shells landing in this area. Because this area is the Second World War memorial, and also all sorts of, including the memorial to Holodomor, to famine in Ukraine, is located in this area. Natural assumption can be that the Russian army is targeting these culturally significant areas, but my assumption is that they were very much targeting the satellite, the mobile communications in this area, and shells were landing in this area. Nevertheless, we observed this area for longer term and then understood the impact on different monuments, how the military strikes at that area were having. But if we look at the central area, then there was a bridge very early on damaged here, and then the Russian army gradually restored at a certain capability, certain ability. They created certain capabilities to cross this bridge. And then also, more importantly, if we look at the central area here, very early on, immediately shells started landing in this college building, old college building, and between that and the cathedral building here, it's actually a school playground, and it's very disturbing to see that early targeting of those areas. And then we also see some damage to the historic buildings. Similarly, if we keep looking at this area, and then if we look at the same historic buildings, then we can see same areas getting more and more damaged over time. We even have an image from March 20th when historic buildings are directly hit and on fire. And if we go further, then earlier on, this building, for example, a gymnasium building, and also was an active hospital, also received a direct hit, and it was completely destroyed in that process as well. In some panchromatic imagery, we can see the shells landing in the historic parts very clearly, and some of the areas that received early damage in March 22, for example, by August 22, already being overgrown with the grass as well. So no reconstruction effort was done there. And then also, Izum was a good example where we could explain that some of the damage to the buildings are not always noticeable from satellite imagery. As we know, the resolution issue is always there, and also cloud cover and the many other issues. So the Museum of Izum is located here. It's famous, and also it's not far from the one of the churches in the city as well. We have reports that both buildings received damage, but seeing that from satellite imagery is not easy. We can see that areas here, for example, are clearly damaged, but the church itself and the museum building, it's not always clear. So I played with some imagery and used the technology that the Planet Labs provides. And the museum building here shows some damage to the roof, but it's not very conclusive. It's not very easy to calculate the percentage of damage or other things. Here comes the support of our Ukrainian colleagues who were reporting damage in some detail. I highlighted here a couple of messages, but from this you can see that museum staff were working very hard to fix the damage to the roof. For example, there were early on some flooding, and also the museum staff or family members of the museum staff who were under occupation, trying to organize their own protection force so they can defend the museum from looting, and organize all sorts of the measures that will help to preserve the very valuable collection at the museums. And they were obviously working without any salaries or any real support from occupation authorities, occupying authorities. And then once the Russians started inviting, for example, museum workers from St. Petersburg to do audit, and there were obviously a very well documented suspicion of the local colleagues what they were trying to do with the museum as well. So these types of information, putting it together with the satellite imagery, gave us some understanding of what was going on in occupied areas, but satellite imagery on its own was not ever enough to understand the entire complexity. And just to highlight some of the points, additional points, external interactions were very challenging, and keeping in touch with everyone was almost a full-time engagement, and still is, and we are a small team trying to do these things on addition to our main jobs. And we deliberately needed to avoid publicity at times because of security concerns. We still do. We tried not to publicize too much, except the audiences like this one, dedicated platforms. And then also I realized very early on that we may never be fully aware of everything that's going on and everything that's being done by other partners elsewhere, and some of our activities probably will end up being replicated, but we decided that that's not a bad thing at all. And then also trying to communicate in a sensitive fashion, even if we notice something that's being damaged, how do we communicate that to relevant colleagues? And then the information sharing early on, we focused on this openness, but that in sharing information with the similar projects or similar initiatives turned out to be a lot more challenging than we expected, because we are not operating in a unified system of platforms, of formats, of everything else. And then also from my personal point of view, that the scale of disaster turned out to be a lot larger than we initially thought. This indiscriminate fire, especially from Russian forces, that's causing a lot of damage in the areas. And so looting-wise, many colleagues ask me, so do you have any observations? I think it's both opportunistic and also some of the organized elements are also taking place there, especially that Izium Museum report is indicative on that. And geography of conflict keeps changing, and that's creating additional challenge as well. Luckily, some of the areas like Izium were taken very fast without much of a firepower from Ukrainian side, so I'm very glad, and that didn't add more damage to the monuments. And we're not as advanced as we wanted to be with our mapping and analytics, because it takes some time to establish all our algorithms and also to create certain approaches in that area. And also internationally, ALIPH was very agile and very responsive very early on, so they provided funding to many of the initiatives in Ukraine and supported Ukrainian colleagues very directly, which I'm very grateful for. And I already mentioned that collecting detailed information is not easy, not only because of the bans on photography, but also communication was heavily restricted in those areas, mobile communication, that we were relying a lot for occupied areas that often had periods of blackout. And I also want to mention the resilience and the dedication of our Ukrainian colleagues. It's incredible, especially led by our colleague Tatiana Krupa, who's a well-known archaeologist and a conservation specialist, but many of the colleagues operating in a very difficult situation, under very difficult conditions, nevertheless providing data and information. So in brief, I'll stop here because I think I already overran my time. Thank you so much. That's in brief about our project.
Thank you so much. This is also so very interesting to see how help and support can be given even from far away, and how the technology can be used as well to map out what is happening. So I think that all the presentations in the different panel really explain to us how the work can be done in order to better protect and to cooperate, more importantly, to cooperate in order to better protect cultural property. So do we have questions? So we have 10 minutes for questions. So we can do, we're going to get 5 minutes of our break. So who has questions? There was a question from Sam in the discussion. Is the practice of marking sites with blue shields going to be revised in relation to conflicts where participants will use them as targets rather than warning? I think, Peter, you said you were going to answer that.
Thanks very much. I mean, we, very simply, we don't see the addition of a blue shield emblem ever having been translated into a help for a target. If people are going to attack cultural property, they know the cultural property they're going to attack in the first place. The addition of the blue shield emblem is a extremely useful thing in the longer term in terms of potential prosecution for war crime, because by having the emblem there, it is a clear indication that the building is protected under international humanitarian law. So if a warring party damages that, there is the possibility for war crime prosecution. But we've never found it, from all our work from the mid-90s, as a clear indication that this is somewhere to bomb.
Thank you. And it is indeed something we haven't mentioned during the presentation, but there is some kind of enforcement and the development of an international criminal responsibility for the willful destruction of cultural property. And that is found in the Al-Mahdi case, which was decided by the International Criminal Court of Justice. What made things a little bit easier in that case was that Al-Mahdi acknowledged its responsibility. So it was not necessary for the court to go much into this kind of discussion, but it was a very important case for the development of international criminal law regarding the protection of cultural property. Do we have other questions? I think everyone is like still thinking about all this information and that we were given. Yeah, there's a question in the text. So for Guy, is that Guy or Gay? Sorry, Guy. Guy. A lot of the technology could be easily applied to pre and post disaster monitoring of climate impacts. Is that also something you are considering of addressing with your work? It clearly has wide-ranging options. And I think this also relates to what Peter presented earlier, that this presentation in time of peace is really important, not just in case of war, but also in case of disaster, as the example of the explosion of Beirut demonstrated. So that is also something, I mean, the impact of climate change and cultural heritage is also a very important question. So Guy.
Yeah, so the satellite imagery, very good question. I mean, the satellite imagery and also the modeling, landscape modeling that I do quite a lot with use of drones and the photogrammetry and the other techniques. It can have multiple benefits, both in terms of the cultural heritage documentation and assessing the damage or assessing the change over time, and also using it for climate observation, climate crisis observation as well. So in Ukraine, if we bring that into the context of Ukraine again, what we also notice is that a lot of change in a grand scale taking place environmentally as well. So we receive daily reports, all of us, from the news reports that certain irrigation systems are damaged, or certain land use systems are damaged. Agricultural facilities were specifically targeted. I'm actually trying to write something about our own biases as well. Whilst we're focusing on cultural heritage, actually how much damage the agriculture is receiving in Ukraine as well. So doing the systematic analysis of change over time, starting a little bit earlier than 2014 actually, to show how change happened in Ukraine because of the Russian aggression and how that impacted different things, not only culture, cultural heritage, but also environment in general, will be very useful longer term. So I think it's a very good question, and it's a very right question as well. One thing to mention, satellite imagery companies are a lot more capable when it comes to the climate change and the climate analysis of the environmental change. I think they're kind of adapting some of those technologies and helping us with understanding of the cultural heritage damage. So it will be very symbiotic, I think, in the future to work on those areas together.
Thank you. I think there was a question as well at the beginning, which also relates to Adnan's presentation. And Peter, I think you mentioned that you might answer that question. It's about the case studies about how heritage has helped communities reconcile after there was a war, so reconcile in time of peace, and how the work, I mean, Adnan's presentation was about how local communities were teaching children about the importance of cultural heritage, in particular archaeology, how the local community as well contributed to inventorying museums, which is also very important to address the trafficking and the looting of cultural objects, as we'll talk about in our second panel. So Peter, do you have a specific example? Or anyone else in the panel, obviously. It's not specifically to Peter, but...
Yeah, if anybody else would like to go first, I've spoken a lot.
No.
Well, okay. I mean, it's a very difficult to find clear evidence of post-conflict use of heritage as a peace-building mechanism. There are some good examples in Kenya, where they have set up a number of peace museums between different groups and communities within Kenya. That seems to be working. There are sort of longer term issues around rather not peace necessarily, but reconciliation. And a lot of that is going on, for example, in Australia between Aboriginal communities and the settler populations. But in a way, trying to turn it around the other way, where if you have good cultural property protection planning in place and delivered by the military during a conflict, you've got, unfortunately, lots of examples where that hasn't happened and there have been problems. But you have got some good examples of where it has been put and there have been no problems. Now that's like, you know, the elephant in the fridge. How do you know the elephant isn't there? Because there aren't, you know, footprints in the butter. But the best one I always use is going back to the First World War in 1917, when the British either, depending on your point of view, occupy, conquer, or liberate Jerusalem. The predominantly Islamic population was essentially terrified of the potential for the Christian Crusades arriving back. And so the commander-in-chief, Allenby, did two things. Firstly, he walked into Jerusalem to show that he was coming in peace. But more importantly, he had a proclamation the next day saying that his troops would guard all of the major sites of all of the three main religions. And by that, he essentially, and to use a military term, but disarmed any dissent from or any problem from the predominant Islamic community. But somebody on his staff then turned a really good idea into a brilliant one, because they deployed troops under Allenby's command from the Indian army, Muslim battalions, to protect the Islamic sites. And as a result of that, so the implication goes, there was no opposition to the military control of Jerusalem while the military were in charge. As soon as the military handed over to the political control, then problems became much worse. So I think it's fair to say that careful working through and careful planning for cultural property protection, taking into the concerns of the local population, was really good, if not brilliant, exercise of CPP.
Thank you. I think this is what, Tim, something you mentioned when you had in the previous presentation, when you were in Mali, isn't it? How you aim to work with the local community, not just as like the French army being there, but actually the French army working with the local community.
Yes, actually, the big question is when a foreign military arrived in a foreign country and we have to deal with cultural property protection, it's not our cultural property, it's not our cultural heritage. We have to ask, what are your cultural heritage? We need to, and therefore it's key to liaise with the local communities to know what is important. What is important is that what the national authorities are putting on the list, or is it that specific traditional trees in the middle of the village, which is important for the local community. So, and therefore, it's to understand the cultural terrain of operation. It's key, and it's not really easy, and therefore we need to liaise with everybody, with the authorities, political authorities, the cultural authorities, to understand what is important and how can the military act to protect it. And also there is time where it's important to protect the cultural heritage, because this matters really for the community during conflict, or sometimes we need to avoid it to protect something other. There was an example where the French army protected a church in Italy in 1943, and the villager came to the commander to say, sorry, but we prefer you to protect our wine cellar as to protect our church, because our wine cellar is our economy, it's our money. So please put your soldiers to protect wine cellar from vandalism. So therefore it's crucial to understand the cultural terrain of operation.
Thank you. Daniel, you have a question?
Hi, yes, I have a question for Tim as well, please. You outlined different ways that heritage practitioners can support the work of protecting heritage with the military. What I wanted to know is, how do you start those conversations? Do we as heritage practitioners, archaeologists, etc., invite military specialists into meetings, workshops, to bridge those divides in order to make sure that the outcome is better protection for heritage in times of conflict?
Yes, it's always a challenge to liaise those two communities. So, and it takes time. It takes time to gain trust, to gain confidence that from a military side we can give you some information to, for example, when we are speaking about monitoring destruction, militaries are on the field. They are looking for destruction. They can report it if they know what are the needs of the heritage community back in England or back in the capital. So it takes time, and therefore every time when it's possible, it's good to have both parts in the same room. And also there is something for me, I spoke about the list. It's quite difficult for the military to create specific cultural property list. We don't know how to do it.
No.
So most of the time. So if the archaeologists, the Ministry of Cultures is sharing list with the military, this makes sense because we can use it. If we don't put something on the map, we are blind.
Yes, I think. Thank you, Peter. And that's also was mentioned earlier. The problem is that many countries do not have up-to-date maps of archaeological sites for different reasons, and pre-conflict, not even during the conflict. Peter, John, you're on mute.
Thank you very much, and sorry for jumping in again. Yes, Dan, it's useful to try and develop conversations, but the military are, don't have this as a primary focus. And so if we're going to interact with them, we have to do it in a structured way. So not that every different heritage organization phones up their local military or writes to the MOD and says, can we have a meeting or whatever. We need to do it in a structured way. And just to give you an example of that, but naming no names, one of my team have just come back from an exercise with NATO, where there was a different heritage, or there was a heritage organization there who were lambasting NATO for essentially doing the military job, for potentially damaging stuff. And that's just simply the wrong approach to go to the military. You need to understand their constraints and their problems and their priorities. And if you can show, which I think you can show, that CPP can help their priorities without damaging it in any other way, then you've got a symbiosis that works. But if you go in and say, you've got to protect this because it's heritage, which I did for 10 years and got it wrong completely, it doesn't work. You have to show that it's going to be something that is going to help them. And that's the discussion in the triangle.
Thank you, Dan. So one last question, because we want to have some time for break.
The guy, really. The use of your GIS to map HER data in Ukraine, utterly amazing. Blew me away, really. I think best use of historic environment record on GIS platform I've ever seen. But is this going to be eventually publicly accessible?
Yes, thank you. I have a lot of clever colleagues, cleverer than me, and they deserve a lot of credit for GIS component. Yes, the aim is very much to make at least the reporting part of it publicly available. And as I said, we're collecting a lot of open data into one place, essentially. Ukrainian colleagues, heritage specialists, were very good pre-conflict, creating this list of the monuments in different regions of Ukraine. Some of those web pages are down by now, but the PDFs were available. So we are basically putting everything together into one. And then the hope is that someone like Minister of Culture or some institutions in Ukraine and organizations like that Paolo represents here, they will take ownership of that data and use it as a baseline or even yet another layer in their own geospatial database. And then it will be very much a discussion between us and then the colleagues in Ukraine, saying which bits of it should we make available. So for example, do we make locations publicly known or do we hide it? And as you all know, it differs from place to place. Some places people are worried about looting and people are worried about the future targeting. But I'm very much with Peter on this, that people, military or looters, if they wanted to know, they already know the locations. So I am very much an open access a supporter in this, but we will still discuss it and do it properly in discussion with all the partners. Every release of information, we also try to discuss it with all partners and trying to make sure that it doesn't damage anyone's interests. So yes, ultimately the methodology at least of it will be publicly available, and we'll make it open access. Yeah.
Thank you. I think I'm going to conclude this session so we can have a little break. So this session really focused on monuments and sites in zones of conflicts and how to protect them and how to prepare those to prepare them for in time of conflict, to avoid damage in time of conflict or other disaster, to document so we know where things are and where they are and what states they are. The next session is going to be on the protection of material culture. So what happens when objects in particular have been looted and are found in other countries. So it's going to be about the antiquities or looted objects and the illicit trade. So we're going to have a different perspective on this. So we're going to have a 10-minute break. So could we just say like 35 past, please, so we don't run too late. Seeing you in 10 minutes, 35, 3:35. Oh, bye. Hi, okay, so our second panel is about antiquities and the illicit trade. I think what we're going to discuss now with different members of the panel from different perspectives as well is the long-term impact, long-term and short-term impact of looting. So what happens when cultural material, when archaeologists, when items are actually have left the country illegally, and how is it possible and to what extent it is possible to have to apply for their return. And we have this obviously with the situation in Ukraine, and I have read articles in the Art newspaper in particular that is showing or that looted artifacts from Ukraine are now showing on the market. So we have this has happened in the Middle East with Middle Eastern artifacts, Syrian artifacts. This happens in all countries that are currently in conflict or not. So our first speaker is Sam Hardy, and is going to tell us why is the market full of loot and what can be done. Dr. Hardy is a cultural property criminologist who has researched cultural heritage work in occupied territories, plus destruction of trafficking of and propaganda about cultural property in the Cyprus conflict, the Syrian civil war, and Russia's war on Ukraine. So, Sam, the floor is yours. Thank you.
A nice meme to start before the miserable things appear, but yeah, I found it when I was looking through looters forums, and it's someone declaring that they're a criminal while stealing petrol from a police car. And that is, unfortunately, very much the level of subtlety with which a lot of looters and traffickers operate. And the basic reason that they are able to operate that way is simply because the market doesn't care. That is the basic reason that the market is full of loot. Collectors and dealers could very simply not buy things that they're not sure about, but unfortunately they don't take that very simple step. It doesn't help that a lot of the people on the market who are selling go to the extra effort of disguising the origins of the material. Some collectors recently who are interested in material from Eastern Europe have simply reverse searched images of objects that are being sold in Western markets like Austria and the Netherlands and the UK and Belgium and elsewhere. And they found that the same images were used without even being edited that had originally been used to sell them by looters in source countries, including Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. And the basic reasons that the market doesn't care is because the market countries don't care. It's rare for market countries to have meaningful police forces with specialist units, rarer still for them to have specialist prosecutors, and even the ones that do often have very little in terms of power. So the Netherlands has one person, Belgium has one person, and both of them are, well, the Netherlands might have two, but in Belgium, the entire unit of one has just retired and been replaced by someone new. The UK has a few people. Like, it doesn't matter how much they care, they simply don't have the physical capacity to police the market. And that's why even dealers at the market end in countries where there is strong rule of law don't really make that much of an effort to disguise what they're doing. And they're often very forthright about it. I've had dealers and collectors contact me specifically, not to deny, well, originally to deny that they did anything wrong, but then to deny that the wrong things were wrong. I had one contact me repeatedly because he Googles himself and forgets that he's complained before. And he starts off by saying he did everything correctly, everything properly. He had the encouragement of some archaeologists to engage in rescue. But once he's argued for a while, and I tell him all of the harm that was caused by his collecting, his response is literally, so what? And I think with that kind of response to the reality of the situation, the only way we will change the behavior of the market is by punishing the people who do things that are wrong. They're not going to be talked around, or except in extremely exceptional circumstances. It's also known that one of the reasons that they get away with this kind of thing and they feel so comfortable is because so many people at the high end of society, often including the people in power themselves, but very often as well the people around them, get away with this and are even protected. I mean, in Turkey, they talk specifically about protected criminals as people who can operate trafficking antiquities or drugs or guns or whatever else, which means that you get organized crime groups forming and continuing, families continuing for not just years, but decades. That's something that we see across the most vulnerable source countries with the weakest rule of law, including figures, for example, like Ilya Travers, whose nickname was antiquarian or antique dealer, and who was very close to Putin during his rise to power. He's clearly not going to be punished for his activities. The same way the prosecutor general in Ukraine before the revolution was obviously not going to be punishing people who were looting and trafficking when he was one of their clients. And this persists even after conflict, then after crises, often when warring parties have been involved, because sometimes governments or communities protect them, like this guy on screen now, who's a British neo-Nazi who went to former Yugoslavia to fight and stayed and carried on looting and has been protected in his looting for decades now because the local community feel gratitude for his support for them during the war. We know that kind of thing is happening in Ukraine now. We know that this icon was stolen from occupied Luhansk and came out through Bosnian Serb paramilitaries and reached Bosnian Serb politicians who gave it to Russia. So we know this kind of thing is carrying on, and they're obviously not going to get policed or punished in those countries. So the only way that we will stop that material being supplied is if we cut off the flow of funds, if we cut off the market that drives it. That's particularly evident because in a lot of these places, as this conversation on a forum for law enforcement officers shows, sometimes the law enforcement officers themselves are the criminals. This is a border guard in Russia showing his metal detector and shovel. This is a looter in Russia who arranged looting within Russia, but over the other side of the border from the occupied territories, encouraged looters from the occupied territories to go to Russia to join in the looting operation. And when they expressed worry about getting across the border and getting back with their loot, he reassured them that the border guards themselves were part of the gang. And when they talked about whether it would be impossible for this activity to continue if Russia annexed the territory and therefore the border dissolved, they said not to worry. They were sure that they would be able to find an arrangement. We also know that it really is a standard thing in conflict for people who are participating in the fighting and people who are collaborating with the fighters to be involved in cultural property crime. This is a looter in occupied Crimea who displayed the medal that he was given for his service to the annexation of Crimea to Russia. And he boasted about the fact that the annexation, the displacement of the authorities, had opened up new territories for him to loot. So we can see very clearly a connection between the crime and the violence, the way that economic and political motives support each other. On the right is a looter who served in Syria in 2015, 2016 at least. And by 2020, he was in occupied Crimea looting there. So we can see that there are connections between people, sometimes the same people, in different conflict zones as well. This is someone in a looting forum who's talking about the fact that he's joined the invading forces to serve as a combat medic in Ukraine. So again, we know that there are criminals among the invading forces because they are advertising the fact themselves. And they really do advertise it, even using the same username on Facebook that they use in their in the forums for criminals. So it's very easy for us to get good information on where they're from, where they've gone, what they're doing, which objects they're finding. In this particular case, we know that the looter was a pro-Russia nationalist, but didn't like the experience of living under Russian rule in the end. So he fled the territory and he's now looting in another country. And it is just a very normal thing that's connected to a lot of other crimes, and people get away with it. So in this particular case, there's a looter who advertises her work on social media under the hashtag Zhensky Cop, Women's Dig. But in her social media channels as well, she shows herself raising protected species. So combining different crimes together. all of which she does very openly and actually monetizes through social media. So even if she doesn't sell an object, this is something that the Athar project have really highlighted in relation to Syria and elsewhere in West Asia and North Africa. Even if they don't sell an object, they can make money by advertising the fact that they're engaging in this activity on social media. So another reason that the market is full of loot, and another thing that we need to do is to make social media companies, big tech, behave differently, so that flow of funding is cut as well. I think I'm out of time, so I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you. That's really interesting to see what is happening, and to see as well how situations of conflict also encourage criminal and encourage people who actually participate in this time of crime. But it's not just about the source countries, or it's also about the end countries where purchasers and collectors don't consider themselves as doing anything wrong. But and I really like this. I mean, not really liked, but found very informative. This approach to social media about advertising illicit activities. I mean, I'm sure that's something that can be dealt with. I mean, you cannot like free advertise that you're selling drugs on Twitter, for example. So what can be done? But we might discuss this later on. Our next speaker is Mark Harrison, who is the head of Heritage Crime Strategy for Historic England, and he is also a research fellow in the Centre for Heritage. Mark is going to present to us how what is being done here in England to protect the cultural heritage and to address criminals who destroy and loot cultural heritage. So Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction. My theme today is a little bit different to what I've done in the past, and so it's using the future to protect our past. As Sophie says, I've got a background in policing and archaeology and fellowships at Kent and Cranfield. And my role at Historic England, just briefly, we are the UK government strategic advisor, statutory advisor on the historic environment. So by that we mean the built historic environments, buildings, archaeological sites, shipwrecks. We're funded by the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport. We provide expertise at a local and national level. And we do have an enforcement capability around breaches of regulatory frameworks. So predominantly for those people that own and manage heritage assets, applying to do works to their buildings. But the majority of my work is with the police and other law enforcement agencies, which is underpinned by a memorandum of understanding with the National Police Chiefs Council and the Crown Prosecution Service, and that is to tackle heritage and cultural property related crime and antisocial behaviour. Why did I get brought in? Well, I'm told it's because I knew something about archaeology and police work, and it was really to provide the response to a piece of work that was commissioned in about 2006 to look at the issue of night hawking. Now, Sophie will tell you that I'm not fond of that phrase. We don't call burglars night hawks. This should be called the survey of theft using electronic metal detecting devices. But anyway, the vernacular was used, 25 recommendations in there, and I think we've pretty much done all of them in the last 10 years. But of course, this is about the small illicit community of detectorists. There are many, many thousands of detectorists that are operating within the law, and they're making great discoveries. Now, I know there will be some archaeologists that say that there shouldn't be any detecting at all. At the moment, there is no bid by the authorities to regulate this hobby. So as long as it's legal, then we embrace it. Now, Terry Herbert back in 2008 found the most extraordinary find. It's now become known as the Staffordshire Hoard. He reported and recorded that in the correct way. It's now rewriting our understanding of the history of England. And a wonderfully observed comedy drama called The Detectorists, written by King Detectorist Mackenzie Crook, really did show how patient you've got to be to undertake this hobby. To underpin our work in enforcement, we have a wider stakeholder group, ARCH, about 200 agencies, public bodies and organisations that act as our eyes and ears. They can bring resources, expertise, powers sometimes, and sometimes funding. And of course, I actually know where the 400,000 protected sites in England are. Statutory designated heritage assets are now listed electronically on the National Heritage List for England. Similar lists in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. And what most people are surprised to hear is the vast majority are owned and managed by the public. Yes, organisations like English Heritage, National Trust, local authorities do, in the grand scheme of things, manage a small number. So for me, the ability to reach out and engage with the public to help them understand how to prevent crime in the first place, and if they are victimised, how to report and record it, is really important. Here's a screenshot of some heritage assets in Herefordshire. So this is all accessible. I've had people saying, well, isn't this a thieves' charter? But it's not information that hasn't been around for over 100 years. It's just more accessible. The way that our government, particularly the Home Office, asks heritage bodies to record crime is not fit for purpose. There is no actual heading that says loss or damage to a heritage asset. And it is beyond mere immunity. It's not just things that are actually doing something and have been doing something for, in many cases, for hundreds of years. It's the fact that it belongs to all of us. It's part of our shared cultural identity. And I just wanted to pose a question to the group, Sophie, in as much as there's an argument to say that we haven't been in conflict as a country since the end of the Second World War. We don't actually use the term looting on a regular basis. But maybe we could put forward the argument that we are in conflict, and our conflict is with organised criminality. Sometimes leading to, well, quite often leading to total loss or irreversible damage. Now, at Historic England, we've now embedded heritage crime, cultural property crime into what we do on a daily basis. This is the national intelligence model. We put all of our work into those silos. And for the first time ever, we now actually have it written down to develop and deliver new and innovative approaches to prevent crime and antisocial behaviour within the historic environment. And Sophie, you've been incredibly supportive of this work since we had some of those lunchtime sessions many years ago. We now grant aid a heritage and cultural property crime analyst, so we understand the scale and extent of the problem. Charlotte completed the most detailed piece of work on the theft of metal from church buildings, which is now reshaping the way that we deliver our plans and activities to prevent and enforce this type of activity. Guidance for owners and managers. Police officers with the skills and the capability to undertake investigations and take enforcement activity. We're even seeing in many forces the rebadging of their vehicles. Here in Essex, you can see Rural Wildlife and Heritage Crime Officer, a uniform patch to indicate that they are specially trained. And are we good at enforcement? Yes, we are. At the top end, we bring people to account. These four metal detectorists who stole what has become known as the Herefordshire Hoard, between them, 26 years in jail. A gang of 5 men who attacked 38 churches across England between 2016 and 18, 27 years in jail. Our ability to convince the sentencing council that these are aggravated offences. So if you are convicted, you are liable to an uplift if it involves a heritage asset or a cultural object. And it includes the sea as well. These 2 men had to invest to complete their crime. A trawler, diving platforms, air, explosives, attacking First World War battleships in the English Channel to get the copper from the engine rooms. Over 4 years in jail and a proceeds of crime confiscation order of £51,000. So that's the first 10 years. What's the next look like? Well, with the development of the police and crime commissioners, the paradigm of policing in England has changed. In the past, we would talk directly to chief constables. Now we speak to the elected officials and encourage them to include heritage and cultural property in their police and crime plans. I'm delighted to say that 11 have taken that on board. Here's 3 examples. And Sophie and I started this as a lunchtime club, a whiteboard, sometimes a sandwich, and it was coming up with ideas around STEM work to actually help us prevent what we've been talking about this afternoon. And now we have over 9 universities working with us, security services, heritage, law enforcement, and of course, academics and students, helping us look at the way we can adapt and, more excitingly, invent and develop new and exciting ways to prevent and investigate crime in the natural and historic environments. I very much agree that the synergy between is very difficult to separate. Here's our partnership. I'm sure it's going to grow. And in closing, just looking at some of the techniques that we're using now, we're actually going back in the past to look at physical marking, the ways that we need to train scrap metal dealers to identify stolen metal. Using forensic techniques, they're not new, but what is new is the way that we're using them to tackle this form of criminality. Here's Rosie and officers from Cheshire Police taking soil samples at Beeston Castle. And this is what they were looking for, the soil that was hiding in the looped and socketed Bronze Age axe head. That went on to help convince the offenders to plead guilty at court. We have a master's programme at Cranfield in heritage crime forensics. And look at what some of our students have done. Tim Carter got 50 employees now. Abby Mitchell, with her app to automate threat assessment, is now the head of quantum computing for IBM in New York. And Kyle developed a new methodology to understand graffiti on heritage buildings. And more recently, our master's students in the School of Engineering at UKC took an idea from us to use the power of the cameras on your smart devices to help police officers to identify historic metals on the back of vehicles or in scrapyards. And this one's my favourite, using the power of photogrammetry and drones to develop models for us, and the imaging that we've developed for identifying heritage metals. We think that we've got an opportunity to automate the way that we undertake threat, risk and vulnerability assessments of archaeological sites, and through deep learning AI, work out what the preventative menu should be for that particular site. So that's my end of my presentation.
Thank you, Mark. I think this is really important point you're making as well about how to protect cultural heritage here in England against the different threats that exist. So we're not only talking about countries that are in conflict. And also I want to mention that whatever protection is actually put in place also helps build cooperation, helps build communication, which can then be used by other foreign forces or other police forces that want the cooperation of the English police force, for example. So I'm sure there will be lots of questions later on about this topic, but we're going to have our third speaker who are going to speak about illicit trafficking on the internet. So our next speaker is Barbara Dimitrisenko, who is an archaeologist at the Museum of London Archaeology. Barbara?
Hi.
Hi, great. So she is going to discuss exactly this. She was appointed by the American Numismatic Society to investigate the online sale of coins with questionable legitimacy. And she was also a researcher advisor for the countering looting of antiquities in Syria and Iraq. So she's been working on these questions for quite a while. Thank you, Barbara. The floor is yours.
Hi. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for the introduction. I will just...
Great, yeah, okay. It's working. Excellent. Thank you.
Here we are. So, good afternoon once again. My name is Barbara Dimitrichenko. And in this presentation, I would like to emphasize the role of the internet in antiquities trafficking, its connection to corruption, funding of crime, fueling conflicts and wars, as well as difficulties in tackling illegal transactions made online. So it's been said gazillion times, even throughout this conference, that antiquities and art had always been attractive spoils of war. It is therefore almost always expected to see an increase of looted artifacts on the market from war zones like Syria and Iraq, for example, where many famous sites, as well as museums, are known to have been ransacked by ISIS and other criminal groups operating in the region at that time. With the onset of wars, we began to see images, for example, also like those shown in previous presentations. Such evidence of looting often comes from photos and first-hand reports that are presented to general public by the international media. And these are nowadays literally flooded with coverage of these issues. The set of pictures on the left, for example, illustrates looting of dramatic scales at archaeological sites in Iraq. Satellite images, as some earlier presentations illustrated, also became a popular tool for quantifying damages to archaeological sites. These satellite images show severely looted Syrian ancient cities of Dura, Europos, and Apamea. Looking at such images, however, we can only guess what may have been stolen, and we will never know when exactly and where on the internet the artifacts will appear. As it's been already said, the looting and export of antiquities is often run by organized crime groups as a result of war-related security vacuum, sectarianism, and last but not least, economic instability. Museums, heritage, and religious sites are targeted to generate income by means of supplying international market with cultural objects, such as these artifacts stolen from museums in Syria and Baghdad, as well as the rare bust that was returned to Syria in 2017. So the internet and online sales platforms play a major role in distributing looted artifacts across the world, as they create plenty of opportunities for anonymous, no questions asked transactions. And the modern use of social media digital communication and virtual transactions make the modern market even more accessible and efficient. Most dealers had by now joined the ever-growing community of virtual sellers with their own sales websites and accounts on Facebook, Instagram, eBay, etc. Various studies, such as the Ether project, had been able to highlight how social media has enabled antiquities trafficking, coining Facebook a one-stop shop black market. At the same time, the internet has also made it easier for non-experts to get involved in trading and develop an interest in collecting ancient artifacts. Some of these hobby buyers purchase antique objects as toys, no matter how much lead they may contain, as craft, jewelry making components, or simply out of curiosity, and don't necessarily fully understand the intellectual and social values they may have. We also see a huge interest in cleaning of artifacts, which gives people sort of exciting hands-on experience in discovering the ancient past. So this type of buyers ultimately seek earth-encrusted, thus potentially freshly excavated objects, as we can see on the slides. These most often come in the form of large coin lots, or hoards, as some misleadingly like to call them, and assorted lots of metal detector finds, often at highly competitive prices. So we can see a clear market shift from traditional lower quantity of high-end objects towards masses of cheap artifacts of small size that can easily be delivered by standard courier services to international destinations. And obviously, without being noticed by border control, these successful transactions even further encourage looting. So it is also important to note that despite being of a small size and on average of a modest value, certain items can still be extremely valuable or have a presence on the market that is strong enough to make substantial profits. So we did a rough quantification focused on a very niche group of artifacts and on the presence of ancient coins for sale on eBay, which showed that in 2020, approximately 2.5 million coins, the value of which was estimated to about 88 to 199 million US dollars, were offered for sale just on eBay. So the value of actual concluded sales may have been in the region of 26 to 59 million US dollars. And again, it is important to know that only a small proportion of these sales came with proof of provenance. So this map in the top right corner illustrates the global demand for Syrian antiquities trafficked on Facebook, for example. And it corresponds with our general knowledge that the US has always been a major destination of antique material. And Europe also holds a strong position on the market, while the involvement of Asian and African markets is somewhat smaller and less understood. So cyberspace is known to be weakly regulated, and the internet allows for plenty of tactics to disguise the nature of virtual businesses involved in trafficking. The most significant of which, again, is falsifying the provenance of objects for sale and perfecting counterfeiting. Vendors can easily avoid specifying which country an object came from, although providing these details of ownership, history, and origin is a legal requirement. Items listed for sale can also come with provenance details that are invented and misleading. So it would be harsh to assume that all unprovenance antiquities are illegally traded, but we must anticipate that certainly are. Often even basic descriptions of items are inaccurate, and there is simply no reliable way of determining from fuzzy online images which country any specific antiquity comes from, or whether it's genuine or counterfeit. Then is this the so-called piggybacking, which is effectively a type of laundering that allows illegal objects to enter the market mixed together with licensed and legally traded artifacts. And this detection avoidance has been concluded to be actually a much more serious problem than previously anticipated. Invented identities and virtual alter egos are used to distract any suspicions and to disrupt the image of the market, creating a confusing network of dealerships with a wide spectrum of opportunities to traffic. Negotiations and anonymous virtual transaction can be made behind the scenes, making it difficult to find out if and how the sales are actually being completed. So the illicit trade has shown to be involving diverse actors along the supply chains, ranging from amateurs to criminals and terrorists. Some operate as individuals and others as networks, all taking advantage of naive buyers and weak regulatory systems. At the same time, many buyers who are new to the market have minimal interest in provenance and have a relaxed attitude toward policies that regulate the market. They often fail to understand the consequences of purchasing unprovenance material and forgeries. And these are the reasons why sales that can indeed be substantial enough to fund serious acts of violence and terrorism continue to take place in front of our eyes. Social media and open sale platforms often offer a convenient and relatively safe environment for mass trading illegal material that is difficult to control. Although antiquities are known to be also traded on the darknet, it appears that sellers don't need to rely on it, as it is less accessible to buyers and less profitable. Instead, their businesses thrive openly on the surface web, reaching broader audiences, which makes it harder to tackle with conventional law enforcement methods that are currently in use to combat other forms of illegal trade. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. This is really interesting to see the extent of this trafficking of cultural property which takes place online, and the extent as well, as you say, many smaller objects on a grander scale, whereas when we look at trafficking, very often we focus on the higher end of the object that might be found in a art dealer's gallery, for example, or shop. So really interesting to have this different approach. We're now going to have our final speaker, who's Dr. Evangelos Kyriakidis, who was a colleague of mine actually at the University of Kent, who is also the founding director of the Heritage Management Organization. And he's going to have a different approach because he's going to look at what happens after looting, and he's going to look in particular at ownership, restitution, and heritage beyond the Parthenon marbles. So what happens when the object is found in a museum or found in an art gallery or otherwise? So please, Evangelos, the floor is yours. And I would like to say thank our speakers. We're back on time, so thank you very much.
That's amazing.
For your excellent timekeeping. Thank you.
So first I must say a disclaimer. I'm not very well prepared for this because I was recruited at the end. But I think it is actually quite relevant to talk about these issues. Mainly because we all see conflict as something that's very immediate, happens very suddenly. It's a crisis. It's what people call a humanitarian crisis, and so there are very specific definitions about this. But for heritage terms, when we're talking about hundreds of years or thousands of years of trajectories, violence and immediacy can be very slow. I just recently was in a workshop organized by the African Union, and I was the only non-African in that meeting, and it was about restitution. And I found myself as not only a token non-African, but also as a token Greek. And quite a lot of people were talking about the Parthenon marbles, which I thought was interesting because there are some elements from the experience of the Parthenon marbles that are relevant, but there are a lot of elements that are not. So just highlighting some of the elements that are not is perhaps a good way to start. Obviously, the Parthenon marbles debate is not necessarily around ownership. Obviously, a lot of arguments have been heard on both sides, and in fact, more than two sides about the Parthenon marbles. But we are looking at a debate at the moment that is on the one side, on the Greek side, centered around this being a national symbol that is kept in a museum called British, and on so that gives an extraordinary motivation for the country to reunite the monument. And on the other side, on the British Museum side, at least on the side of the trustees and senior staff, this is an extraordinarily important piece that used to be the centerpiece of the museum, not anymore. And so therefore both sides maybe are quite animated, more animated than would be normal. And Greece is one of these countries that's actually quite interesting because it is not seeking to restitute everything. It is buying the argument that quite a lot of these items are showcased internationally and so on and so forth. So, for example, the Temple of Apollo at Basse, another World Heritage Site that is made by the same architect as the Parthenon, is also housed in the British Museum, but there is no noise on the Greek side about this. But to go beyond that, so this is not necessarily the case with everything, because especially for conflict, but also for previous conflicts, long-term or short-term, call it occupation, call it colonization, call it whatever, we're talking about a legal argument very often. We're talking about that, Greece feels, for example, it may pursue, but has not done yet. And it's different time scale again. There is a legal argument, there is a moral argument about conflict, because especially for the recent conflicts that we all experience now and our short-term memories see, we have this immediacy for restitution, for recovery, for unification, etc., that is not so relevant in the case of the Parthenon. So recently there has been a general effort, German, Dutch, little French, little British, to return items to several African countries, especially in West Africa, especially Nigeria, and a little Benin. A lot of the Benin bronzes come from the region of Nigeria called Benin. And so very often the case is that a box is handed back to the country with items that, they are basically, people are being told, now it's your responsibility, this is our restitution. And because we have had the Parthenon experience and we have seen what the arguments are from the side of the global museums, one of the main arguments has been that Greece cannot host these items because it does not have the appropriate museums, it does not have the appropriate conditions. Think of conflict as a not appropriate condition. It does not have the expertise, perhaps, so it does not have the right staffing to look after, display, exhibit these items. And of course, Greece went through an enormous palaver of building a purpose-built museum to accommodate for this, and then concentrated on research, including research showing that the British Museum did not look after very well after the Parthenon marbles. The protocols for cleaning the marbles in the past included horrendous horrendous practices that destroyed a lot of the evidence and a lot of the evidence of color, of workmanship, etc. So this is a little bit of a catch-22 situation. Because we are seeing items being handed back without much other help. And so these items are very likely in the next 10 years to not have been displayed appropriately. It is possible that they will not have seen a proper conservation program and so on and so forth. So it is very likely in 10 years' time, some of these global museums will go back to the source countries and say, look what we have been saying all along, you did not look after these well, so why should we give you anything else? And this will be, unfortunately, a terrible thing for what we're trying to do. So my take is that one of the items that is going to stir much of the debate is ownership. So we have to recognize ownership of the source countries. We have to recognize sovereignty of the source countries. And we may start a discussion with source country governments, but also source country local communities. In some of these countries, there are indigenous leadership groups that are quite responsible, some cases quite knowledgeable. So a dialogue is a second step, and an identification of capacity is a third step. And really we have a moral obligation. So perhaps repatriation is not so correct, because repatriation is a very simple act. Restitution is perhaps more correct, because we're talking about the return, appropriate return and correction of a mistake, be that by the way colonization or occupation, as I was saying yesterday. You know, there are empires that have attacked and occupied in much worse ways than just colonized, other countries did. And you know, now we're looking at an occupation situation. So we need to be correcting this mistake by trying then, after that discussion, after the mapping of capacity, after identifying the challenges, after recognizing sovereignty, we need to actually work together to build that capacity and to make sure that there are appropriate places, but also learn, because for you know, for many people, and you know, who are we, let's say, on the side of a museum that is putting the stool of a chief or the cult statue of a particular group behind a glass case? Who are we to tell about conservation principles to the chief that would be sitting on that stool, or to the group where they would be locating the statue? Ultimately, it is going to be their decision, but on our side, let's say, on the side of the global museums, obviously I'm not working for a global museum, but just for the sake of the argument, we need to be looking at full capacity and full dialogue. But first of all, we need to be recognizing sovereignty and to recognize the temporality of our retaining these objects. And so to go back to conflicts, because very often, colonization happened often with a lot of conflict. Occupation certainly happened with a lot of conflict. We really need to be looking at not just repatriation, but we really need to be looking at proper restitution that would include the capacity for the country to look after the items in the way that they think is most suitable, once they of course know what we consider good practice, and then they decide for themselves what is their good practice. So we'll shut up here and let you go on with the rest.
Thank you. I think a lot of food for thought as well in this presentation about ownership, who owns heritage, and in particular when that heritage has actually moved, traveled, journeyed from one country to another in circumstances that were not peaceful. So we do have the floor open now for questions. I think we had the comments by Dan about the use of language. I think it's indeed about whether you call the Parthenon marbles or the Elgin marbles, or it's also interesting to use the source countries and market countries. I mean, is that also a terminology that is adequate? So I don't know, Evangelist, do you have something to say, or Dan, do you want to expand on that comment first question?
Well, actually, can I ask a separate question first of all and come back to that, please? I have something in mind. Fantastic presentations on illicit trade, antiquities, etc. Do we have anything tangible in terms of figures? What this global trade is worth? What are we looking at here? I mean, we've talked briefly, Barbara, on the coins, but do we have an idea, either globally or even nationally in the UK, what the trade in illicit antiquities is worth? Sam maybe, or Evangelist, no?
I think UNIDOC have said that it's fourth behind drugs, wildlife crime and firearms, and I'm not sure if it was dollars or pounds, but 17 billion something.
Jesus.
Yeah, but the numbers are all,
yeah.
I mean, everyone wants to be the third.
Yeah.
And then when they accepted they couldn't be the third, they went for fourth.
Yeah.
But I mean, like guns, drugs, medicine, wildlife, all of these things are probably worth a lot more. And it's difficult to know how much.
I'm not saying it's right. I'm just.
I know. I'm just saying, like, I think the important thing is to remember most, if not all, of the numbers are bullshit. and it doesn't matter exactly how much. The people who attacked Paris and Brussels, the network around them was ransoming stolen paintings back to art insurance companies. They made more money by ransoming those paintings back than they spent on the operation, and it was only 50,000 euros. So, like, they don't need to make a lot of money to do a lot of harm. And a lot of the people doing this at a low level, especially in poor countries, whatever, they are kept poor so that they keep on supplying. So in that sense, the market deliberately tries to avoid too much money being in it because they don't want to spend their own money. They just want the profit.
Yeah.
But a lot gets looted while they're doing it.
I think it's a very difficult question to answer because by definition it's illicit, so it's not measured. But we also have to take into consideration the impact on the intangible as well, heritage on the culture, on the well-being of people, and on the long-term effect this can have on communities, which is also not difficult and measurable in economic terms. Evangelos?
First of all, just very brief answer to Dan. I wasn't whitewashing the term. I was just trying to say that it would be offensive to call these marbles Elgin. You could call them Phidias, you could call them Parthenon, you could call them many things, but calling them Elgin is derogatory. But Sam, don't you think that one could, as guns and drugs are exchanged for art in the illicit trade, I mean, isn't it fair to say, although we wouldn't be able to put a number on it, isn't it fair to say that a portion of the ultimate value of, the portion of the ultimate value of art exchanged, be it heritage or, let's say, more recent or modern, is equivalent to a portion of the trade in guns and drugs, plus some.
I mean, plus a lot, I guess. But like it's definitely they're all tied up together. Some of the people I showed in Turkey, they trafficked guns and drugs and antiquities. One of the mafiosi who was imprisoned in the UK, I think it's the first time that they used something like an unexplained wealth order to confiscate assets. He was done because he was a massive heroin smuggler. But when they were trying to recover assets from him, one of the things they took was a statue, which was worth £1.5 million, and that was restituted to Turkey. So yeah, definitely, they're all tied up together, and some of the money flows back and forth, and they all assist each other, and it is significant.
So perhaps not so useful to try and put a number to it, rather than just pile them all together and say, this is actually really serious crime. And unfortunately, it's only the art side of things that is not coming with very heavy penalties, and is not taken as seriously as guns and drugs. But it's actually part of the same picture. Yeah.
I was at a workshop on wildlife trafficking, and they invited me because they wanted to get like a few people in connected trades, and they were apologizing that their data was only from like 190 countries and it was 3 years old, and the equivalent that was on the UNESCO website was 9 countries and 9 years old. It's just incomparable, and we really do need to start systematically analyzing it to be able to systematically police it.
I think that also echoes what Mark said earlier about how crime is recorded in England, for example. If it's a theft of a painting, it will be actually recorded as theft, not a cultural property theft. So it's also about more having a better understanding of Mark, you're sharing your screen. I don't know if you're doing that on purpose.
Yes.
But it's also about a better recording of crimes. I think I want to move on as well. So I don't know, Mark, if you have something quick to say, because Peter has his hands out and wants to ask a question. So, so Mark, do you want to add something quickly to that?
Yes, I do, and it follows on from everyone's points. These are ancestral footprints at Haysborough. They're exposed by tidal erosion. They're 800,000 years old. They were trashed, that's technical language, by off-road motorcycles. How on earth do we get the police service to record that? Because on their box it says, what's the value? Now, we all know that that's priceless, totally priceless. Yes, it will eventually get eroded away again, but we'll have time to record it. But once it's gone, it's gone. So we have to record it as criminal damage more than £5,000. But I'm getting crime registrars saying, well, how do you know that? We've got a long way to go. a long way to go.
The Spanish, though, they asked, there's a group of Spanish academics and I think people in the Ministry of Culture and maybe in law enforcement agencies as well. They appear to have made some progress towards developing a system to discuss value, to be able to demonstrate it. I don't know, I can't remember off the top of my head whether it's economic as well. It might require legal reform to get non-financial harm recognised, but it seems like there are ways that people are starting to be able to do that.
And I think it's around objects, Sam. This is, you know, the historic environment. That's really tricky.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry to cut you short there. Peter, do you have a question? Comments or?
Not a question, but a very quick comment, and it really follows from Mark's in a way. It's a different measure of value. So we were having this, I was having a very similar conversation in with a military audience a few years back, and people were throwing up, you know, figures like X number of million or billion or whatever. And a senior 4-star US general said, "Sir, if it's only $100,000 US a year in relation to one conflict, those $100,000 US buy an awful lot of bullets to kill my," in his words, "boys and girls." And we just have to think of it, you know, with that mindset in a different context. It doesn't necessarily translate just to money.
Thank you. Yeah, indeed. Dan?
Just one point. I liken what you've been saying about how we value things, and not just in a tangible monetary value, in the same way that archaeology and heritage works within the planning system. It's really confined by this heritage assets. It's tangible, it's measurable, it's based on an economic value. And how do you measure those other intangible values? And these are debates that the planning system is struggling with at the moment, particularly with heritage and cultural heritage. So it's really encouraging to hear these the same debates, the same issues are happening in heritage and crime.
Yeah, and I think regardless of anyone's views on our constitutional monarchy, I think what we're seeing is people respecting over 1,000 years worth of tradition. And this might be a really good time for us to really make some of those points, is that once it's gone, everyone.
Yes, which is why heritage needs protecting, because it's like the natural environment, a finite resource.
Yep.
A finite resource that doesn't always have an economic value.
Yep.
On those words, do we have one last question, Hannah? Last question, and then I'm going to give floor to Joe to conclude.
Thanks. So I was just I put it into the chat, but basically I was just wondering where the speakers sit with tensions between public members of the public across the world basically looting in times of conflict to save themselves from extreme poverty or loss of livelihood and all that, versus the need to police these crimes.
Is that Evangelos? Do you want to answer this question? Yeah.
Well, there is obviously a lot of sympathy for people who don't have other means, but there are two key issues here. The first issue is actually the people who are selling the items, the first, let's say, step of identifying an item and selling it, they are making the least value of the whole chain. So there is a whole chain of value, and less than 1% of that value goes to the first person who's selling. There are a lot in every step of the chain and needs separate measures. You cannot be dealing with local communities in the same way as you're dealing with collectors. You cannot be dealing with collectors in the same way as you're dealing with mediators. You cannot be working with mediators the same way as you're talking to storage people, you know, and so on and so forth. So for this particular issue, we really need to have a multi-pronged strategy for all the other steps of the value chain. And so that's the first part of the answer. And the second part of the answer is, obviously, we need to have proper community engagement so that people fully understand the damage they are doing to their own communities, and so that there is peer pressure from their communities. I've got a lot of anecdotes about this. I'm working in a part of Greece, in Crete, in the highlands of Crete, where people have got guns. There's very little reach of the state, and people can talk openly about illicit finds. They can give them to you without fearing police intervention or the state coming. And I can tell you that, you know, after proper community engagement for several years, these people are reporting these things on their own. And so, and you can find who did it, you can find their telephone number. You don't even need to talk to them because they also know that you found out, and they'll stop. So I think, you know, peer pressure is what happens in these situations. And in order to have peer pressure, the same thing happened with Daesh, by the way. One of the reasons why it was so easy to loot these things was because local communities did not feel affiliated to this heritage. And it was with local, let's say, tolerance, if not consent, that quite a lot of what was destroyed was destroyed. Yes, I know it's not so simple, but there is at least one PhD I know that actually can illuminate this further. You know, I think local community engagement is the answer for these people, nothing else.
Yeah, I think we saw that this morning as well. We talked about earlier today. We have a question.
We're in a very similar position to, say, the wildlife crime sector was 30 years ago. It was very much so what 30 years ago. But they've now got to the stage where they've got over 20 members of staff in the National Wildlife Crime Unit. We don't have a complementing heritage and cultural property crime unit at the moment. Maybe we should. I don't think it would take that many people to make a real difference. Some of our offences are fiendishly difficult to investigate, and you need talented people, maybe tax experts, economic crime experts, people that know the way policing works. But I think if we had that, it would start to form an effective deterrent. I suppose when I started, I was the only heritage crime officer in the country in 2010.
I was absolutely delighted when you were appointed. I remember it was a while ago.
Thank you.
I also thought in my old cynical way, that's great, but it's one person, which is a lot better than no person. But
yeah, but we've now got at least one heritage crime officer in each police service in England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. On Wednesday, I was in Wiltshire, where we started to train another 15. Now, these are going to be predominantly looking at what we would call neighbourhood crime, those types of antisocial behaviours that affect our communities on a day-to-day basis. Serious organised acquisitive crime, that's a different skill set. We know we can do it. You know, I showed you 3 examples of how we can do it. If a measure of success is, have you prosecuted any Nighthawks? Then yes, we have. Before we started, I think there'd been 1 prosecution. Since we've started, we've now got people going to jail, and they are being hit, and we are showing that crime doesn't pay. You know, proceeds of crime confiscation orders are from personal asset. But I think if we did have some sort of coordinated team, we would make a lot more of a difference.
Thank you, Mark. I think this is actually a good, but we have made progress. You have made progress. So let's keep on that trajectory, and I'm going to give the floor to Joe now to conclude this very interesting conference. So I want to thank the speakers and give the floor to Joe, who is the current chair of Rescue, who is also a professional archaeologist for many years and who has he was best known for the discovery of an Anglo-Saxon cemetery at Rath. I'm sorry, I can't speak it very well. But only you can introduce that. So she's a brilliant archaeologist and she's an excellent chair of Rescue doing a lot of work. So the floor is yours. Thanks, Joe.
Yeah, it's flicking in and off, on and off, but I think it's there now. I just want to say what a really amazing afternoon we've had. Incredibly interesting and thought-provoking. And very interesting to look at all the different elements, from the chaos that you see at conflict, and where there's sort of lack of regulation or will, and the impact of the internet, which allows things to happen so easily. But it's also been really interesting to see the ways that it's being tackled and the legal frameworks behind it, even if they're not always implemented or implementable in certain circumstances. But it also struck me that although a lot of the time you think you're talking about the objects and the sites, but of course what it's about is it's all about the people. So it's about the people who lose through these crimes, the people who take and the people who take advantage. As we saw in Syria, it's also the people who mend it and the people who fix it, and how building communities back together, how important that is as well. So I think we've covered so much ground. It's really been sort of a fascinating and informative afternoon. So it just remains for me to say thank you. Now, I would first of all just like to thank Dan for his incredible determination and drive to get this conference off the ground. As we know, he's really had a very difficult last few days with all the impact of the things that have been going on in this country in the last week, and despite all of that, he's sort of kept at it and managed to make this happen. And I'd also like to thank Sophie for absolutely impeccable chairing of the conference. It's been really useful, really well done. So thank you, Sophie. But of course, but I think I got to the point of thanking the speakers for their incredible contributions that were so interesting and informative. And I really thank you all for keeping to time as well, because we only had an afternoon, and the conference would have been poorer if we hadn't been able to fit in all those different elements of the discussions. So, and that was only possible by, unfortunately, only giving people very, very short times. So, so thank you very much, all of you, for contributing in that way. And I'd particularly like to thank those of you who stepped in at the very last minute. As we know, it was all a bit chaotic right at the end there, with some of our speakers being unable to contribute. And so thank you very much to those of you who had very little preparation time, but your contributions really kept the whole thing together and gave us something that's been so worthwhile. So so really that's just to thank you all again, thank everybody who's contributed and everybody who's attended, because it's having the people there to give the questions and to keep the whole, to sort of develop the themes in those question and answer sessions that's so important. There's obviously lots more to discuss, and I think we've really, for me anyway, who knew very little about this, I think we've really started a theme of something that there is be a lot of value in taking forwards. And so I hope that this won't be the last time that we can discuss these issues and see what we can do about it. And with that, I think it just remains for me to just thank you all very much once again. Truly successful and worthwhile afternoon, I think. Just good luck to those of you that are currently in very difficult circumstances. We do think about you. I think that's it, just to say thank you and goodbye.